It was just another regular afternoon in Maplewood, a sleepy suburban town known for its tree-lined streets and the faint hum of everyday life. The sun was high, casting a golden glow over the rows of neatly kept homes and the quiet, winding roads. The type of place where nothing ever really seemed to change, where everyone knew everyone else. People waved as they passed each other on the sidewalk, and children played in the yards, blissfully unaware of the world beyond their little bubble. At least, that's how things seemed on the surface. Inside Maplewood's central shopping plaza, life was moving along at the usual pace. Shoppers strolled through the aisles of the grocery store, a few teenagers lingered near the mall entrance, laughing and scrolling through their phones, and elderly couples wandered through the small boutiques. It felt like any other day, until it didn't. Trey Matthews was walking back to his car, a plastic bag filled with snacks hanging from his hand. He had just grabbed a few things from the grocery store for his mom, who had been working late all week. Trey had dreams of making it out of this quiet town and going to college on a scholarship, but for now, he was just a normal 17-year-old with his head full of ambition and his feet firmly planted in a world that didn't always seem to get him. As he approached his car, he noticed a woman standing nearby, eyeing him carefully. Janet Collins, a woman in her early 40s with platinum blonde hair and the look of someone who prided herself on being the quintessential suburban matron, stood with her arms crossed, watching him. Trey couldn't help but feel a sense of discomfort rise in his chest. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him that way, but for some reason, it was different today. Maybe it was because of the way her eyes darted back and forth, as if she was sizing him up or waiting for something. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was nothing. After all, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He just needed to get in his car and head home. "Excuse me," Janet called out, her voice sharp and commanding. Trey paused, turning to face her. "Yes. I saw you," Janet continued, her eyes narrowing. "You've been hanging around here for too long, looking suspicious. What are you doing?" Trey's brow furrowed. Suspicious? He was just standing by his car, checking his phone. It wasn't like he was causing trouble or loitering. But in the back of his mind, a thought started to gnaw at him. He knew exactly what she was implying. "I was just getting some snacks for my mom," Trey said, trying to keep his voice calm and collected. "I don't think so," Janet snapped. "I saw you walking around the store for way too long. Something doesn't add up." Trey took a deep breath, his hands tightening around the plastic bag. "Look, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just trying to get home." But Janet wasn't backing down. "I think you're up to something," she said, her voice rising with an edge of suspicion. "I'm calling the cops." Trey's heart skipped a beat. His stomach turned into a knot as the words hit him like a cold slap. The cops. Here. For what? For walking through a shopping plaza in broad daylight? Before he could say anything else, Janet had already pulled out her phone and dialed. Trey felt his mind race, the anger bubbling up inside him. He was about to be dragged into something that wasn't his fault, something that shouldn't even be happening. But there was nothing he could do. He had to wait. As Janet spoke to the operator, Trey could feel the eyes of a few passers-by glancing in his direction. Some seemed curious, others a bit uncomfortable, but none of them dared to intervene. He stood there, the bag of snacks in his hand now feeling heavy, as he was thrust into an entirely new kind of spotlight. The minutes stretched out painfully as the sirens in the distance began to grow louder. Trey's anxiety started to rise, the familiar feeling of being unfairly judged wrapping itself around him. His mind flashed back to times before, when he had felt like an outsider, times when people had looked at him differently, treated him differently, just because of the color of his skin. Why? Why was this happening again? All he had done was go to the store for his mom. Finally, the police arrived. 2 officers, a man and a woman, stepped out of their patrol car, their eyes immediately scanning the scene. Trey tried to remain calm, but his heart was racing, his palms sweating. He had to explain himself, had to prove that he was innocent, that he wasn't some threat just because he was a black teenager standing alone in a mostly white neighborhood. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his voice firm. Janet immediately pointed at Trey. "This boy was loitering in the plaza. I saw him acting suspicious. I don't know what he's up to, but I think he's up to no good." Trey could feel his body tense up. This wasn't right. He was being accused of something he hadn't done, and it was clear to him now that his race played a role in how this situation was unfolding. He opened his mouth to explain, but the officer cut him off. "Hold on," the officer said, raising his hand. "Let's hear from him." Trey took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I came here to buy a few things for my mom, and now I'm just trying to go home." The officer eyed him skeptically, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than Trey would have liked. "Is that so?" Trey nodded, his frustration growing. "Yes, it's the truth." Janet stood nearby, her arms still crossed, her expression hardened. "I don't buy it. Something just doesn't feel right." Trey could feel the tension in the air, the weight of her suspicion pressing down on him. His body was tense, his fists clenched at his sides. What was this really about? Was it just because he was black? He wasn't sure, but something about this situation felt all too familiar. And then, just as the officers were about to ask more questions, the sound of a car pulling into the parking lot broke the silence. A black SUV rolled up, its windows tinted dark. The vehicle came to a stop just a few feet away, and Trey glanced over at it, wondering who it could be. But the door opened, and a woman stepped out, her heels clicking on the pavement. She was tall, wearing a sharp black suit, her dark hair pulled back into a neat bun. Her presence was commanding, almost intimidating. The officers immediately straightened up, their demeanor shifting in an instant. Trey recognized her immediately. It was his mom, Agent Tasha Matthews, the FBI chief. The look on Janet's face was priceless. Her jaw literally dropped as she stared at the woman who had just arrived, clearly out of her element. Tasha walked over to the officers with purpose, her eyes scanning the scene. "Is there a problem here?" Tasha's voice was calm, but there was an authority in it that left no room for doubt. The officers froze, and Janet's face drained of color. Tasha turned to Trey. "You okay, baby?" Trey nodded, a mixture of relief and disbelief filling him. "What are the chances?" The officers, now visibly rattled, didn't know what to do. The whole situation had just flipped on its head. Janet stood there, dumbfounded, her eyes shifting between Trey and Tasha. She had no idea what she was about to learn. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Janet Collins was still standing there, stunned, unable to process the reality of what had just unfolded before her. She had called the police on a teenager, accusing him of loitering and being suspicious, only to find out that the young man she had assumed was a threat was the son of one of the most powerful women in law enforcement. Tasha Matthews, the FBI chief, stood tall and composed, her eyes never leaving Janet. Her gaze was calm, but there was an undeniable edge of authority in it. Trey, on the other hand, was trying to keep his composure, but his heart was still racing, a mixture of relief and lingering tension clouding his mind. Janet stood frozen, 1,000 thoughts racing through her head. How had she gotten here? How had she not known? In her mind, she had never intended for things to escalate this far. She had just seen a teenager hanging around, and the uneasy feeling that had built up inside her had led her to make that phone call. The cops would sort it out, she thought. He would be gone, and everything would go back to normal. She never imagined that her assumptions, her gut feelings, would lead to this moment, this realization. Tasha turned to the officers, her expression still composed but now tinged with a hint of frustration. "Is there an issue?" she asked, her voice firm yet controlled. The male officer swallowed, clearly caught off guard by the presence of the FBI chief. He stammered, looking between Tasha and Janet. Ma'am, we were just. I know what you were doing, Tasha interrupted smoothly, her voice steady. You were about to question my son based on an assumption. An assumption that led to an unnecessary escalation. She didn't raise her voice, but there was no mistaking the weight of her words. The female officer, now equally uncomfortable, glanced at her partner before speaking. We were just doing our job. But if this is your son, then. Yes, it's my son, Tasha said, her voice cutting off the officer. And I suggest you think very carefully about how you handle situations like this in the future. Without proper cause, you could be putting people in danger, both civilians and yourselves. Her words weren't an accusation, but more of a warning, one that left both officers standing awkwardly, unsure of how to proceed. They had been caught in the act of racial profiling, and there was no way to deny it now. The tension in the air was palpable, and Trey could feel the sting of humiliation creeping up his spine. Janet, on the other hand, was in a state of shock. She had no idea what to say or do. Her mind was reeling. The realization that she had been so quick to judge, to assume the worst of a young black teenager, struck her like a punch to the gut. She hadn't meant for it to go this far. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But in her mind, Trey had been just another face, another teenager who didn't belong, someone she thought was out of place in her neat, white neighborhood. But now she was standing in front of his mother, one of the most powerful women in the country, and she could feel the weight of her mistake pressing down on her chest. The shame was suffocating. Tasha glanced at Trey, her expression softening. Are you okay, baby? She asked again, her tone now gentle, motherly even. Trey nodded slowly, not trusting his voice at first. I'm fine, Mom. Just frustrated. Tasha's eyes flickered with understanding. She placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it lightly. I know, sweetheart. I know. Janet, still speechless, finally took a hesitant step forward. She swallowed hard, trying to find the words. I didn't know, she began, her voice cracking slightly. I didn't realize who he was. I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought he was acting suspicious. Tasha's gaze hardened just a fraction, her voice steady but carrying an edge. You thought he was acting suspicious because of his skin, didn't you? The words hit Janet like a slap, and for the first time in her life, she felt the full weight of what her actions had meant. She had made a snap judgment, based solely on Trey's appearance, without ever considering that he might just be a normal teenager like any other. She had acted out of fear, out of a lifetime of being conditioned to see people who looked like Trey as something less than, something dangerous. I didn't mean, Janet stumbled over her words, struggling to form a coherent apology. But the damage had already been done. She could see it in the way Trey was standing, in the way his shoulders were tense, his eyes distant. He was hurt, and there was no undoing the pain that had already been caused. Tasha let out a sigh, her expression softening slightly. She wasn't angry, she had long learned that anger wasn't always the most effective response. But the disappointment in her eyes was clear. I don't think you meant to hurt him. But the fact is, you did. And you need to understand that. Janet nodded slowly, the weight of her actions beginning to settle on her shoulders like an anchor. She had made a mistake. She had allowed her own biases, her own assumptions, to dictate her actions. And in doing so, she had hurt someone who didn't deserve it. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Trey's gaze never wavered from the ground, and Janet stood there, caught between guilt and shame. The officers stood awkwardly to the side, unsure whether they should intervene or leave it to the FBI chief to handle the situation. Finally, Tasha spoke again, her voice calm but firm. Janet, I'm not here to lecture you. But what I will say is this: you have to take a long, hard look at yourself and ask why you thought what you did was okay. Because this isn't just about Trey. This is about a system that encourages people to make assumptions, to treat others based on the color of their skin. And it's something that doesn't go away overnight. Janet felt her cheeks flush with shame. She wasn't used to feeling like this, not in her perfectly curated world, where everything had its place, and where everyone followed the rules. But now, standing in front of Trey and his mother, she realized just how little she understood about the world beyond her own narrow perspective. I'll think about it, Janet said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I really didn't mean. I'll think about it. Tasha nodded, her expression softening ever so slightly. That's all I can ask for. But remember, actions have consequences. And it's on all of us to challenge the assumptions we've been taught. Janet nodded, her eyes welling up with unshed tears. She didn't know if she could ever undo the damage she'd caused, but she knew one thing for sure: this moment would change her. It had to. Tasha turned to the officers, giving them a sharp look. And as for you two, I'd suggest you take some time to reflect on how you handle situations like this in the future. Make sure you're not reinforcing the very biases that create these kinds of encounters. The officers, now clearly embarrassed, nodded quickly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Tasha turned back to Janet one last time. I'll make sure my son gets home safely, she said, her tone gentle but resolute. But I hope you take this opportunity to make some changes of your own. Because if we're going to get anywhere, we all need to do the work. With that, she took Trey's hand and turned to leave, the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. Janet stood there, frozen, watching them go. Her mind was spinning, but one thing was clear: she had a lot of work ahead of her if she ever hoped to make things right. And, in some strange way, it all began with this moment, this uncomfortable confrontation. This was the turning point. The drive home was quiet. Trey stared out of the window, his mind a whirl of thoughts, all tangled up in the surreal events of the day. His mom, the FBI chief, had shown up like some kind of superhero, swooping in to save him from the uncomfortable mess that had unfolded in Maplewood. But as grateful as he was, there was still that lingering sense of frustration, that gnawing feeling that he couldn't shake. Why did things have to go this way? Why did people always assume the worst of him because of his skin? Tasha, on the other hand, remained calm, focused, as she always did. She was used to handling high-pressure situations, whether it was a high-stakes case or, in this case, an incident with her son. But this was different. It wasn't just another criminal or suspect, this was her child, the person she loved more than anything in the world. And seeing him humiliated like that, especially by someone who had so easily jumped to conclusions, cut deeper than anything she had faced in her career. After a few minutes, Tasha broke the silence. You okay, Trey? Trey didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the passing landscape, the trees and houses blurring into a stream of color. He wasn't sure how to put what he was feeling into words. How could he explain to her that no matter how many times it happened, it never got easier? How could he explain the frustration of always having to prove himself, of constantly feeling like he wasn't given the benefit of the doubt? I'm fine, he muttered, his voice lacking conviction. Tasha sighed, her gaze flicking to him briefly before returning to the road. I know you're not fine. But you're strong, Trey. You always have been. Trey shook his head. I don't feel strong. I just feel tired. His words hung in the air between them, heavy with all the unspoken emotions that he couldn't express. He was tired of being judged before he could even speak, tired of being labeled based on the color of his skin, tired of the fact that people seemed to see him as a threat before they saw him as a person. He was tired of fighting a battle that wasn't of his making. Tasha's eyes softened as she took in his words, but she didn't respond immediately. They were on their way back to their house now, a modest home in a quiet neighborhood just a few miles from Maplewood's shopping plaza. It wasn't a mansion, but it was theirs, a place where they had found a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos of Tasha's high-powered career. "Listen, Trey," she began after a long pause. "I know today was rough. It shouldn't have happened, and I'm so sorry you had to go through that. But I need you to remember something: the way people treat you is a reflection of them, not you. Their prejudices, their assumptions, those are their problems, not yours." Trey let out a bitter laugh, though it wasn't one of amusement. "Yeah, well, it sure doesn't feel like that. It feels like it's my problem. It feels like I'm the one who has to constantly prove I'm not dangerous, not some criminal. Every day. And I'm just tired of it, Mom." Tasha's hand tightened on the steering wheel, her expression hardening as she fought the emotions rising inside her. She knew that feeling all too well, the exhaustion of being in a world that didn't want to see you for who you really were. She had been through it herself, time and time again, in her career and personal life. But her son, Trey, was the one person she couldn't protect from this world. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Trey. I want you to understand that," Tasha said, her voice low and serious. "You don't have to carry the weight of their ignorance. You are worth so much more than their judgments." Trey turned to her, his expression a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. "You can say that, but it doesn't change the way they see me. It doesn't change the way I feel when people look at me like I'm the problem. And I get it, I do. I know what you're trying to do, but it just doesn't work. It doesn't change the fact that I'll never get to just be." Tasha took a deep breath, her grip on the wheel loosening slightly as she approached their house. She pulled into the driveway and shifted the car into park, the engine humming quietly. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air in the car felt thick with all the emotions that neither one of them knew how to express. "You're right," Tasha said finally, her voice soft but firm. "You will never get to just be in the way that others do. You'll always have to be more than just yourself. You'll have to be twice as good, work twice as hard, and even then, people will still judge you. That's the reality we live in." Trey looked at his mom, her face solemn but resolute. She was speaking the truth, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. How could it? He wasn't sure when it had all started, when he had first realized that he couldn't just be a teenager, couldn't just exist without carrying the weight of other people's expectations and prejudices on his shoulders. Maybe it had been when he was just a little kid, or maybe it had been later, when the looks from strangers turned into something more. "Why do we have to keep fighting?" Trey asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why can't things just be simple for once?" Tasha's eyes softened, and she reached over to gently squeeze his hand. "I don't know, baby. I wish I had a simple answer for you. But we don't have the luxury of simplicity. We have to keep pushing forward, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us." Trey's gaze dropped to his lap, his fingers playing with the hem of his shirt. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he wanted to ask her about what it meant to carry this burden, but the words stuck in his throat. Tasha continued, her voice steady despite the emotion that flickered behind her eyes. "The world isn't fair, Trey. And sometimes, we have to make our own peace with that. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting for what's right. You might not see it now, but everything you do, every time you rise above, every time you prove them wrong, you're making a difference." Trey turned back to look at her, his face a little more open now, though the frustration still lingered. He didn't know if he fully believed her, but he could see the determination in her eyes. She had spent her entire career facing battles that most people couldn't even imagine, and yet she still stood strong. If anyone understood what it meant to push forward in the face of injustice, it was his mom. Tasha smiled, though it was small. "You're stronger than you know, Trey. You have everything it takes to make it through this. And no matter what anyone says or does, I will always be here for you. Always." Trey took a deep breath, trying to let her words sink in. He wasn't sure if he could ever fully let go of the anger and hurt that had been building inside him for years, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe he didn't have to fight alone. "I'll try, Mom," he said finally, his voice quieter. "I'll try." And with that, they sat there in the car for a few more moments, the world outside still and silent, as they both came to terms with the weight of the day. The world wasn't fair, and they couldn't change that. But together, they would keep pushing forward, one step at a time. The next morning, the sun broke through the curtains in Trey's bedroom, casting long, golden streaks of light across the floor. It should have been a new day, a fresh start, but the events of yesterday were still fresh in his mind. He hadn't slept well. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Janet Collins, the white woman who had called the police on him, had kept him awake long into the night. He had thought about how quickly things could have spiraled out of control, how his mom had stepped in, how the officers had been forced to confront their own biases. It was a lot for one night. As he lay there, staring up at the ceiling, Trey couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of unease that still clung to him. It wasn't just about the incident with Janet, though that was a big part of it. It was the realization that nothing was ever going to change unless people made a conscious decision to change their behavior. And from the way Janet had acted yesterday, defensive, dismissive, he didn't have much hope that she would. His phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. He groggily reached over and saw a message from his best friend, Jordan. "Jordan, yo, you good? Heard what happened?" Trey rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the lingering fog of sleep. Jordan was one of the few people who really understood him, who didn't just see him as another black teenager, but as a person. Still, the message felt like a reminder of everything that had happened. He sighed before typing back. "Trey, I'm fine. Just tired. But yeah, it was messed up." A few seconds later, Jordan replied. "Jordan, I bet. You know that's not okay, right? What she did?" Trey stared at the message for a moment. Of course, he knew it wasn't okay. But was it even possible to get through to people who were so entrenched in their own way of thinking? His finger hovered over the keyboard as he tried to find the right words. "Trey, yeah. It's just, exhausting, you know." He hit send, letting the words hang in the air between him and his friend. Jordan's reply came almost immediately. "Jordan, I feel you. But don't let that mess with your head too much. You know how we gotta move." Trey thought about that for a moment. His friend was right, there was always an extra layer of pressure when you were black. He couldn't afford to slip up, couldn't afford to be seen as, just another troublemaker. It wasn't fair, but it was his reality. And maybe that was the hardest part, accepting that things weren't going to change just because they should. Before Trey could respond, his phone buzzed again, but this time it was a call. He glanced at the screen and saw it was his mom, and he answered immediately. "Hey, Mom," Trey said, trying to sound normal. "What's up?" "Hey, baby," Tasha's voice came through, steady as always, but there was something different in her tone today. "We need to talk." Trey sat up in bed, running a hand through his hair. "What about?" "I just got off a call with the department," she began, her voice crisp. "There's going to be an investigation into what happened yesterday. I wanted to give you a heads up." Trey's heart skipped a beat. An investigation? He had known his mom would take this seriously, but hearing her say it out loud made it all feel more real, more public. "Are they going to do anything about it?" Trey asked, his voice tight. "There's a chance they'll issue a formal review of the officer's actions," she explained. "The mayor's office is involved, and we'll see what comes out of it. But it's important you don't let this get to you. I'm here. We're going to handle it." Trey fell silent, not sure how to respond. He appreciated his mom's calm demeanor, her steady approach, but a part of him felt like it wouldn't make any difference. How many times had the system failed people like him before? Mom, do you think anything will actually change? I mean, really change? Trey asked, the frustration creeping into his voice. I hope so, Tasha answered quietly. But I've been doing this long enough to know that change doesn't come quickly, and it doesn't come easily. It's going to take time, and sometimes it feels like we're fighting an uphill battle. But that doesn't mean we stop. Trey let out a slow breath. He couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what his mom did, no matter how hard she fought, there would always be people like Janet Collins, people who saw him not as a person, but as a threat. It wasn't something he could change. All he could do was keep moving forward, even when it felt like the world was set against him. I get it, Mom, Trey said finally, though his voice felt heavier than it should have. I just don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. Tasha's tone softened, a rare moment of vulnerability in her voice. I know, Trey. I know. But you don't have to carry this alone. We'll get through it together. Trey took a deep breath, nodding even though she couldn't see him. Thanks, Mom. After a few more words of reassurance, Tasha hung up, leaving Trey alone with his thoughts once again. But the weight of the conversation lingered, along with the frustration that had been building up in him for years. He wanted change, but it felt so far out of reach. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Trey went through the motions, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Janet, about the way she had looked at him with that mix of fear and suspicion. And what made it worse was that he couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time something like this would happen. He would always be fighting against people who saw him as a problem before they saw him as a person. That evening, Trey found himself sitting in the living room, his eyes glued to the TV screen, though he wasn't really watching anything. His mind kept drifting back to the conversation he had with his mom, to the investigation, and to the uncomfortable realization that nothing would ever truly be easy for him. Not because of who he was, but because of how others would see him. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw another message from Jordan. Jordan, yo, you want to hit the court later? We can talk about all this stuff in person. I got your back. Trey smiled, the small act of kindness from his friend giving him a sliver of hope. He needed that, someone who could see him without all the baggage that came with his skin, someone who would just treat him like a person. Trey, yeah. Let's go. I'll meet you there in an hour. He threw on his sneakers, grabbed his basketball, and headed out the door. For a moment, he let himself forget about the weight of everything that had happened. For a brief second, he could just be a teenager again, playing basketball with his best friend. But deep down, Trey knew that nothing would ever be the same. He would never be able to escape the tension, the fear, the prejudice that followed him everywhere he went. But maybe, just maybe, he could learn how to carry it. The cool evening air hit Trey's face as he jogged down the street to the basketball court, the familiar rhythm of his footsteps bringing some semblance of normalcy back to his otherwise chaotic thoughts. His mom's conversation, the investigation, the racial tensions, everything that had happened yesterday felt like a mountain sitting heavy on his chest. But as he approached the court, the sounds of bouncing basketballs and laughter filled the air. It was a reminder of something simpler, something he used to enjoy without all the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. Jordan was already there, waiting by the fence, his arms crossed and a smile on his face when he saw Trey approaching. You good, man? Jordan asked as Trey stepped up to the court. His voice was light, but there was a certain seriousness in his eyes that made Trey appreciate the effort his friend was making to check in. Yeah, I'm good, Trey said, though he knew it was only partially true. He wasn't completely fine, but he didn't want to talk about everything just yet. Not here, not now. Jordan nodded, dropping his arms to grab the basketball. You want to run a few games? We can keep it chill, just shoot around for a bit. It's been a crazy day, I can tell. Sounds good, Trey replied, trying to match his friend's easygoing demeanor. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Basketball had always been an escape for him, a place where race didn't matter, where he wasn't Trey, the black teen who had to prove himself. On the court, he was just Trey, the player. For a few hours, that was enough. The two of them spent the next hour running drills, shooting baskets, and talking about everything except what had happened the day before. Trey was grateful for the distraction. It was a welcome break from the pressure that always seemed to be hanging over him. As they took a water break, Trey leaned against the fence, the cool bottle in his hand offering a brief respite from the heat of the game. Jordan took a deep gulp, then set the bottle down and looked at Trey with a serious expression. "Look, man," Jordan said, his tone quieter now, "I know you're dealing with a lot. You don't have to keep it all in, you know. You've got people who've got your back, me, your mom. We're here for you." Trey hesitated, not sure what to say. He was grateful for Jordan's loyalty, but the weight of the world had a way of making it difficult to lean on anyone, even the people who cared about him most. "I don't know, Jay. It's just, all this stuff, you know. It's like, no matter what I do, I'm always gonna be seen differently. And I don't know how to fight that." Jordan nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the ground for a moment before meeting Trey's eyes. "I get it. But you're not alone in this. I know it feels like it sometimes, like you're carrying all this weight on your own, but you don't have to. We all got our battles, but you don't have to face yours by yourself. You've got people who care." Trey took a deep breath, the words sinking in more than he expected. It wasn't that he hadn't heard this before, his mom, his teachers, his friends had all said similar things. But hearing it from Jordan, hearing it from someone who didn't have to say it, made a difference. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he felt. "Thanks, man," Trey said, offering a small smile. "It means a lot." Jordan slapped him on the shoulder, a grin returning to his face. "No problem. Now, let's get back to the game. You're not getting off that easy. I'm still beating you." Trey laughed, the sound coming easier now. For the first time in a while, he felt something close to relief. A tiny glimmer of hope flickered inside him, not because everything had changed, but because he knew he had people who cared, who were there for him when the world didn't always seem to be. When Trey got home that night, the house was quiet. His mom had just finished up some late-night work, as usual, and was sitting at the kitchen table, looking over some paperwork. The weight of her responsibilities had always been evident to Trey, but tonight, there was something different in her posture, something that told him that she, too, was feeling the pressure. "Hey, Mom," Trey said as he walked into the kitchen, tossing his backpack onto the couch. "You still working?" Tasha glanced up from her papers and smiled faintly. "Yeah, just a little bit. It's a never-ending cycle, you know." Trey nodded, taking a seat across from her. "Yeah, I know the feeling." He paused for a moment, then added, "Jordan and I played some basketball tonight. It helped." Tasha raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Really? You didn't mention you were going out." "I'm glad it helped, though. You need time to unwind." "I know," Trey said. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming absently on the table. "It's just. I don't know. Everything feels like it's happening at once. The investigation, school, all the stuff with Janet. I feel like I'm just supposed to keep going, but sometimes it feels like too much." Tasha set her papers down, her expression softening. "I understand, Trey. I do. It's hard when you feel like you're stuck between worlds, never able to fully be yourself because of how others see you. But you don't have to face it alone." Trey didn't say anything for a moment. The words she was offering were comforting, but the reality of his situation was a little more complicated. "I know, Mom. But sometimes I wonder if all of this, everything we do, everything we fight for, is going to make a difference." Tasha's gaze was steady, unwavering. "It will, Trey. It may not seem like it right now, but it will." Change doesn't happen overnight. And sometimes it feels like the fight is impossible, but that doesn't mean we stop. We keep pushing, one step at a time. Trey sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. I just want things to be different. I don't want to keep feeling like this. I know you do, Tasha replied, her voice soft but firm. And I wish I could give you that. But the only way to make a difference is to keep moving forward, even when it's hard. And I'll be here with you, every step of the way. Trey met his mom's gaze, her words sinking in more than they ever had before. It wasn't easy, but maybe, just maybe, he could find the strength to keep going. You're right, Mom, he said quietly. We'll get through it. Tasha smiled, her pride in him evident in her eyes. Together. As the night wore on, Trey thought about the conversation, about everything that had happened, and about everything that was yet to come. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but with his mom by his side, and with friends like Jordan, maybe there was still a chance for peace. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. The following week passed by in a blur of mixed emotions. Trey woke up each day to the same weight hanging over him. The events with Janet Collins, the police, and the looming investigation kept playing on repeat in his mind. It wasn't just the incident itself that had him on edge, it was the uncomfortable realization that, despite his best efforts to live a normal life, his skin would always define how people saw him. He tried to keep his head down at school, focusing on his studies, making sure he didn't give anyone a reason to pay attention to him. But the rumors were spreading. It seemed like every time he turned a corner, someone was whispering or staring. The entire school was talking about the incident. He couldn't escape it. Even his teachers had been acting differently around him. Some gave him sympathetic looks, while others seemed a little too cautious. It was like they were all waiting for something to happen, waiting for him to either snap or make a mistake. It made him feel more isolated than ever. During lunch on Thursday, Trey sat at his usual spot in the cafeteria, his eyes flicking nervously around the room. The chatter around him felt louder than usual, but he couldn't quite place why. Jordan, sitting across from him, seemed unusually quiet. Trey looked at his friend, who had been scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly. You okay, man? Trey asked. Jordan's eyes darted up to meet Trey's, then quickly looked away. Yeah, I'm fine, he muttered, but his tone was off, there was something he wasn't saying. Trey raised an eyebrow. Jordan, what's going on? Jordan let out a heavy sigh, putting his phone down. You're gonna hate me for telling you this, he started, then quickly added, but I need you to know. He glanced around the cafeteria, making sure no one was listening, before continuing. There are rumors going around, people saying that Janet's trying to get you expelled. Trey froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The room seemed to grow colder as his thoughts raced. He couldn't believe it. He had thought the whole thing with Janet would blow over, but hearing this now, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. She's what? Trey finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. Jordan nodded grimly. Yeah. Some people are saying she's telling everyone that you threatened her or that you were acting suspicious when the cops arrived. It's all lies, but they're sticking. People are starting to believe it. Trey leaned back in his seat, trying to process what Jordan had just told him. It didn't make any sense. Janet had already embarrassed herself in front of the police, in front of everyone who witnessed the scene. But now she was going to lie. Was she really so set on making him out to be the villain that she was willing to destroy his reputation? Why the hell would she do that? Trey asked, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. Jordan shrugged, his face tight. I don't know. Some people just can't let go of their pride. And some people, well, they'll do anything to cover their own mistakes, even if it means dragging someone else down with them. Trey's mind was racing. He had tried to let go of what had happened with Janet. He had tried to move past it, but now it was clear that things weren't going to just fade away. He would have to confront her again. But he couldn't just let this go. Not when she was trying to ruin everything he had worked for. Before he could say anything more, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Jordan slapped him on the back. "Hey, don't let it get to you. We'll figure it out. Okay?" Trey nodded, though his thoughts were far from settled. He gathered his things and made his way to class, his mind swirling with thoughts of how he was going to handle the situation. He had already dealt with enough, he didn't need this kind of drama on top of it. Later that evening, Trey found himself pacing in the living room. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. The rumors at school, the investigation, Janet's lies, it was all too much. Tasha was in the kitchen, fixing dinner, but she could tell something was wrong. "Trey, what's going on?" she asked, her voice calm but concerned. Trey stopped pacing and ran a hand through his hair, taking a deep breath. "It's Janet. She's spreading lies about me at school. They're saying I threatened her, and now people are starting to believe it." Tasha paused in the middle of chopping vegetables, her knife halting in midair. She turned to face him, her expression hardening. "She's doing what?" "I don't know why," Trey continued, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I mean, she called the cops on me in the first place. She was the one who got everything wrong. But now she's lying about me, making up stories about what happened." Tasha's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak right away. She set down the knife carefully, walking over to Trey with measured steps. "This is exactly what I was worried about," she said softly. "You know the truth." "I know the truth. But people don't always care about the truth. They care about what they hear, what they're told." Trey's shoulders slumped. "I don't know what to do, Mom. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't do anything wrong." Tasha stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know, baby. I know. But sometimes, the hardest thing is having to prove yourself when no one wants to listen. You can't control what people say, but you can control how you react." Trey felt a lump rise in his throat. He knew what his mom was saying was true, but the idea of fighting another battle, especially one where he felt so powerless, felt like too much. He just wanted to be a regular teenager. He just wanted to move on with his life. Tasha's voice softened again. "You're not powerless, Trey. You've already shown that. You're stronger than you think. And we'll figure this out, okay? We'll deal with it." Trey looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know, Mom. It feels like I'm always fighting something. And I don't know how much longer I can keep doing it." Tasha gave him a small smile, a reassuring glimmer in her eyes. "You don't have to do it alone. We'll handle this, one step at a time. Trust me." Trey exhaled slowly, the weight of the day pressing down on him. "Thanks, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." "Don't worry about it," she said, her voice firm but warm. "We're in this together." As the evening wore on, Trey tried to push the thoughts of Janet and the lies out of his mind, but the fear gnawed at him. The next day at school, he knew things were going to get worse before they got better. The rumors were already spreading, and there was little he could do to stop them. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let Janet or anyone else define who he was. He would fight, no matter how exhausting it was. For himself. For his family. For his future. The next day at school, Trey could feel the tension in the air the moment he stepped onto campus. The whispers, the furtive glances, it was impossible to ignore. Everywhere he turned, he could feel the weight of the rumors pressing down on him. Even his friends, normally his safe space, were a little different. They didn't ask him how he was doing. They didn't give him the usual half-joking, half-serious nudges. They just watched. They observed, like they were waiting for something to happen. Trey tried to shake it off as he walked down the hallway, his shoes squeaking on the freshly waxed floor. But the feeling in the pit of his stomach grew heavier with every step. It wasn't just the students anymore, even some of the teachers seemed to be acting strange, giving him looks that weren't quite as warm as they used to be. His first class of the day was history. Trey walked in, trying to focus on what was happening around him, but his mind kept drifting back to the rumor mill. As soon as he sat down, his history teacher, Mr. Daniels, walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder, an awkward smile on his face. "Hey, Trey," Mr. Daniels said softly, leaning down to his level. "I just want to remind you to keep your head down today. There are a lot of eyes on you, and things could get tense." His tone was low, almost conspiratorial, like he didn't want anyone else to overhear. But Trey couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness at the way Mr. Daniels phrased it. "Be careful." Trey nodded, though he couldn't bring himself to say anything. "I'll be fine," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if that was true. By the time the lunch bell rang, Trey was already exhausted. He hadn't learned much in class that day because his mind kept drifting to the conversations happening around him, most of which he didn't even want to hear. He gathered his stuff and made his way to the cafeteria, where he found Jordan sitting at their usual spot. Jordan didn't look up at first, his eyes glued to his phone, but when Trey sat down across from him, he looked up, offering a quick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Did you hear what happened?" Jordan asked quietly, his voice tinged with concern. "Some of the kids in third period were talking about how Janet's dad is talking to the school board." Trey's heart sank. "What does that mean?" Jordan looked around nervously before speaking again. "Some people are saying she's trying to get you expelled. She's telling everyone that you threatened her, that you made her feel unsafe when the cops showed up. If her dad's involved, it could get really bad. Like, they could push to have the school suspend you or something." Trey clenched his fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms. The weight of Jordan's words hit him like a brick. He couldn't believe it. How could Janet keep lying about him? Why couldn't she just admit that she was wrong? "I didn't do anything to her," Trey muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't even say anything threatening. Why is she doing this?" Jordan shrugged. "I don't know, man. Some people just don't like being proven wrong. And if she's got her dad pulling strings, she could make this a whole thing. You've got to be careful." Trey leaned back in his chair, trying to take it all in. He had hoped that things would die down, but it seemed like everything was spiraling out of control. There was only one thing left to do. "I'm going to confront her," Trey said, his voice firm despite the rising anger inside him. "I'm not going to let her ruin everything I've worked for." Jordan frowned, leaning forward. "Are you sure about this? You know it could make things worse, right? People might start looking at you like you're the one making trouble." Trey's gaze was hard. "I don't care. She's not going to get away with lying about me." After school, Trey walked to the bus stop with his mind made up. He wasn't going to wait for the rumors to ruin his life. He wasn't going to sit back and let Janet tear everything down without standing up for himself. He couldn't afford to be passive anymore. By the time he got home, his mom was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing some files for work. Trey tossed his backpack onto the chair and stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. "Mom," he said, his voice tense, "I need to talk to you about something." Tasha looked up, her eyebrows furrowing with concern. "What's wrong, Trey?" "I'm going to confront Janet," he said, his tone resolute. "I'm not letting her lie about me anymore. I don't care if it makes things worse. I can't let her destroy my reputation." Tasha was quiet for a long moment, her gaze softening as she observed her son. She knew that Trey was frustrated and hurt, but she also knew that his emotions could cloud his judgment. "Trey," she said carefully, "I understand that you're angry. You've been through a lot. But you need to think about how you handle this. Confronting her might not be the best way. It could escalate things." "I don't care," Trey snapped, then immediately regretted the sharpness in his voice. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. I can't sit back and let her do this. I have to stand up for myself. Tasha set her pen down, folding her hands in front of her. I'm not saying you shouldn't stand up for yourself, Trey. But I want you to think about the consequences. Sometimes confronting someone who's trying to hurt you only gives them more power. You have to ask yourself if it's worth it. Trey looked down at the floor, the weight of his mom's words sinking in. I don't know if I can let it go, he said quietly. I feel like if I don't do something now, it's just going to keep getting worse. Tasha's expression softened, and she walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. I know, baby. I know. But you don't have to fight this battle alone. And you don't have to fight it with anger. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is take the higher road. Trey stared at her, his mind torn between the desire for justice and the fear of making things worse. He was just a kid. How could he handle this on his own? Tasha continued, her voice steady and calm. You've got your friends. You've got me. We'll figure this out, okay? But let's be smart about it. Trey nodded slowly. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the one he needed. His mom was right. He had to take a step back and think carefully about how to handle this. As the night wore on, Trey sat in his room, staring at the ceiling. The anger and frustration that had fueled him earlier slowly ebbed away, replaced by a heavy uncertainty. He wasn't sure what the next step was, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let this define him. He couldn't let Janet win. Tomorrow, he would make his move. But for now, he had to be patient. The next day, Trey stood in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection with a mixture of determination and apprehension. The events from the previous days had weighed heavily on him, and as much as he had tried to push the negativity out of his mind, it seemed to have a life of its own. Today, he was going to confront Janet. He couldn't wait any longer. But even as he said the words in his head, a part of him wondered if he was making a mistake. His phone buzzed on the bathroom counter, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, seeing a text from Jordan. Be careful today. I don't like where this is heading. You sure about this? Trey stared at the message for a moment, the weight of his friend's concern settling on him. Jordan had been his rock throughout all of this, but even he was starting to see how dangerous things were getting. Trey hesitated for a moment before typing back. I have to. I can't let her get away with this. If I don't stand up now, she'll keep doing it. He hit send and set the phone down, taking one last look in the mirror before heading out the door. At school, the atmosphere felt thick, like something was about to crack. The whispers were louder than usual, and the glances lingered a little too long. Trey couldn't tell if people were looking at him with sympathy or suspicion, but either way, it made him uneasy. He walked through the crowded hallways, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. He just needed to get through the day, and after that, he would face Janet. His first class passed in a blur, the words from the teacher barely registering as his mind stayed focused on his plan. The bell rang, and Trey gathered his things, heading to lunch. He had already decided that he was going to find Janet in the cafeteria. He wasn't going to wait for her to find him, and he wasn't going to let her hide behind the rumors any longer. As he approached the lunchroom, Trey saw her sitting at one of the tables with her friends. Her blonde hair was in a messy ponytail, and she was laughing, completely unaware of the storm that was about to come. Trey felt his heartbeat quicken. The anger that had been simmering for days bubbled to the surface, but this time, he wouldn't let it control him. He was going to confront her calmly, make her see that what she was doing was wrong. He walked up to her table, his footsteps loud in the otherwise quiet cafeteria. Janet looked up, her expression going from amusement to a tight smile when she saw him. Her friends exchanged nervous glances, but Janet didn't seem intimidated. Instead, she just raised an eyebrow, as if waiting for him to speak. "What do you want, Trey?" she asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I've already told the police everything, if that's what you're here for." Trey stood tall, trying to suppress the frustration that was threatening to boil over. He needed to keep his composure. "No, Janet. I'm not here to talk to the police. I'm here to talk to you." Her smile faltered, and she glanced at her friends, who all suddenly looked very interested in their food. Janet crossed her arms, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. "I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish by confronting me," she said, her tone colder now. "You should just accept that people don't always believe you. That's how life works." Trey leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. "No, Janet. What's going on here is that you're lying. You're spreading rumors about me, trying to make me out to be the bad guy, and I'm not going to stand for it anymore." She scoffed, rolling her eyes as if his words meant nothing. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh? You think you can just walk in here and accuse me of things? People already know the truth, Trey. They're just not saying it to your face." Trey's eyes narrowed. "The truth? The truth is that you made a mistake, and now you're trying to cover it up by making me the villain. You're scared because you know you're wrong, and instead of owning up to it, you're trying to ruin my reputation." Janet opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, a voice cut through the air, louder than Trey expected. "That's enough, Janet." Trey turned around to see Ms. Collins standing at the entrance of the cafeteria, her arms crossed and her eyes sharp. For a moment, he felt his heart drop into his stomach. Ms. Collins was Janet's mother, and she was the last person he wanted to be involved in this mess. "Mom," Janet said, her voice filled with surprise and frustration. "What are you doing here?" Ms. Collins' gaze shifted to Trey, and he immediately felt the coldness in her stare. "I think we need to talk, Trey," she said, her tone clipped. "This behavior is unacceptable. You've caused enough trouble for my daughter, and now you're making things worse." Trey's jaw clenched, but he stayed quiet. He wasn't sure if confronting Ms. Collins was the best idea, but part of him felt a surge of confidence. "Your daughter has been spreading lies about me, Ms. Collins. You're trying to protect her, but I'm not going to let her ruin my life." Ms. Collins' eyes narrowed, her voice cold. "I suggest you watch how you speak to me, Trey. I don't have to remind you of the consequences of defying me." Her words hung in the air like a warning, and for a brief moment, Trey felt a flicker of doubt. But he couldn't back down now. "I'm not afraid of you, Ms. Collins," Trey said, his voice steady. "I'm just trying to make things right." The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Janet shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly unsure how to react. Her mother, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, her expression hard as stone. For a moment, it felt like the entire cafeteria had gone silent. Trey could feel the eyes of the other students on him. He wasn't sure if they were waiting for him to crack or if they were just enjoying the drama. But either way, he knew he couldn't back down. "Not now." "I've done nothing wrong," Trey said, his voice rising just a little. "But if you want to keep playing games, fine. You'll regret it. Because the truth will come out. It always does." Ms. Collins didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, with a final look at Trey, she turned and motioned for Janet to follow her. "This isn't over," Ms. Collins said, her voice low and menacing as they walked away. Trey stood there for a long time, watching them leave, his mind racing. The confrontation had gone differently than he expected, he had spoken his mind, but it hadn't felt like a victory. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain, the fight wasn't over. As he walked away from the cafeteria, he couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was brewing. Whatever came next, he had to be ready. And this time, he wasn't going to let anyone walk over him again. Trey's phone buzzed again as he stepped out of the cafeteria. He pulled it from his pocket, seeing a message from his mom. How did it go? Everything okay? Trey paused for a moment, staring at the message. He didn't know if he should tell her everything that had just happened. He didn't want her to worry. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't keep it from her. It's not over. But I stood my ground. I won't let her lie about me anymore. He hit send, feeling the weight of his words settle on him. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but he was finally ready to face whatever came next. The following days at school felt like walking through a fog, heavy and thick with uncertainty. Trey couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than he had anticipated. The confrontation with Janet and her mother had been tense, but it wasn't over. Janet's influence, bolstered by her mother's position, was far-reaching, and Trey knew he had only scratched the surface of what was coming for him. His phone had been buzzing constantly, each notification bringing a new twist to the drama. Most of the messages were from Jordan, checking in on him and offering support. But there were also others, whispers of gossip from classmates who had caught wind of the confrontation and were now fueling the fire. Some sided with Trey, others with Janet, and a few even seemed to enjoy watching the chaos unfold. Trey couldn't help but feel exposed, like everyone was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. By the time Friday afternoon rolled around, Trey was exhausted. He had barely been able to concentrate on his schoolwork all week. Every conversation in the halls, every passing glance, felt like a reminder of the war he hadn't wanted to be a part of. And now, as he sat at lunch with Jordan, he could feel the tension between them as they discussed the situation once again. "Man, I don't know if this is going to end well," Jordan said, his brow furrowed in concern. "Janet's dad is really powerful, and her mom. She's got connections. You're already in deep, and I don't want to see you get dragged into something bigger than you can handle." Trey leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of Jordan's words. "I know, but I can't just back down. If I do, she wins. I don't care about her connections or whatever power she thinks she has. What she's doing is wrong, and I'm not going to sit here and let her ruin my life because of a lie." Jordan exhaled, clearly torn. "I get that, but you've got to be careful. Janet's already got her story out there. People are starting to believe her, and they're starting to turn on you. You might need to find a way to play this smarter, not just, go in guns blazing." Trey's eyes narrowed, frustration creeping in. "I'm not just going to lie down and take it. She's the one who's making things worse, not me." Jordan raised his hands in surrender. "I'm not saying you should just let her walk all over you. But there's got to be another way to deal with this. Maybe you could get some adults involved, get the truth out in a way that doesn't just make everyone hate you." Trey was silent for a moment, processing what Jordan had said. He knew that Jordan was trying to help, but it felt like every option was just a variation of being passive or bending to Janet's narrative. Trey wasn't the type to stand by while someone lied about him. He couldn't afford to let this drag out any longer. "I don't know, man," Trey finally said, running a hand through his hair. "It feels like the whole school's against me now. I don't think anyone's going to care about the truth. They've already made up their minds." Later that evening, after the last bell had rung, Trey headed home, his mind a swirl of thoughts. The argument with Jordan still lingered in his mind, his friend's warning echoing in his head. But Trey's resolve hadn't wavered. He couldn't let this lie define him. He couldn't let Janet and her family manipulate the situation any longer. When Trey got home, Tasha was already in the kitchen, making dinner. Her smile when she saw him walk through the door was warm, but Trey could see the concern in her eyes. She knew something was off. "Hey, how was school today?" Tasha asked, as Trey slumped into a chair at the kitchen table. "Same as usual," Trey muttered. "A bunch of people staring, whispering. I can't concentrate. It's like I'm public enemy number one." Tasha frowned, placing a plate of food in front of him. "I'm sorry you're going through this, baby." But I need you to know that you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out. Trey sighed, his frustration bubbling up again. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I've tried talking to Janet, but it's like she's got the whole world on her side. Her mom is pulling strings, and I don't know how to win this. Tasha sat down next to him, placing her hand on his. You don't have to fight this battle alone. I'm going to make some calls. We'll find a way to get this straightened out. Trey looked up at her, his expression conflicted. I don't know if I can keep doing this, Mom. Every day feels like it's getting worse. People are starting to believe her. What if it's too late? Tasha squeezed his hand. It's never too late, Trey. You have to keep standing tall, keep telling your side of the story. Sometimes, people don't see the truth right away. But it will come out. And when it does, you'll be stronger for it. Trey stared at her, unsure whether he believed her, but he wanted to. He wanted to believe that everything would work out in the end. That justice would prevail, and he wouldn't have to fight this battle forever. The next morning, Trey woke up to the familiar sound of his alarm buzzing in his ear. He groggily got out of bed, still thinking about everything that had happened. As he was getting dressed, his phone buzzed again. It was a text from Jordan. I talked to some people today. The word on the street is that Janet's dad is going to go to the principal. It's getting serious, man. You should be careful. Trey's heart skipped a beat. Janet's dad was already involved. This was escalating faster than he had anticipated. He quickly texted back. I don't care. I'm not backing down. He had to stay strong. He had to keep his head in the game. There was no way he was going to let Janet and her family get away with this. The truth would come out, even if it meant he had to keep pushing forward. At school, Trey could feel the storm brewing. The halls felt quieter than usual, the air thicker with tension. People were whispering, casting furtive glances in his direction. He could feel the eyes on him as he walked to his first class, but he refused to let it get to him. By the time lunch rolled around, Trey was already tired of the stairs. He walked into the cafeteria, his mind set on confronting Janet once more. But as he stepped inside, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. Janet was sitting at a table with a group of older students who were known for their connections with the school administration. Trey's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just about school anymore. Janet wasn't just playing a high school game, she was involving the adults now. He was officially in over his head. As he walked past their table, Trey heard Janet's laugh ring out, sharp and mocking. His stomach twisted with frustration and helplessness. He knew the truth, but it felt like no one was willing to listen. The next few days were a blur of tension, escalating accusations, and endless whispers. The battle Trey was facing was growing larger and more complicated than he could have ever imagined. Janet's lies had spread, and now it seemed like the entire school was aligning against him. But one thing was certain, Trey wasn't going down without a fight. The weight of the situation hit Trey harder with each passing day. What had started as an isolated conflict with Janet had quickly transformed into a full-scale battle, with friends, enemies, and even adults caught in the crossfire. Trey had expected high school to be hard, but this was something else entirely. It felt like every corner he turned, there was another obstacle waiting for him. The stakes were higher now, and he knew he had to make a move before it all spiraled out of control. By the time Monday rolled around, Trey was already dreading the day ahead. The weekend had been filled with frantic phone calls with his mom and Jordan, who were trying to help him figure out how to handle the situation. Janet's dad, Mr. Collins, had indeed made his way to the principal's office, and now there was a rumor circulating that the school was considering taking action against Trey for the disturbance he had caused. Trey knew this was just the beginning, but it felt like a personal attack on everything he had worked so hard to build. He entered the school building, his heart pounding as he walked past the lockers, barely noticing the usual chatter of students around him. He had never felt so isolated. The whispers felt louder today, like they were following him, pressing in from every side. He wanted to ignore it, but he couldn't. Not when his entire reputation was on the line. As he headed to his first class, Trey saw Miss Collins standing in the hallway, talking to a couple of teachers. She was wearing her usual perfectly put-together outfit, but today, she had a different energy about her. She looked like someone with power, and for the first time, Trey truly felt the weight of who she was. Ms. Collins had connections, and she wasn't afraid to use them. Trey's pulse quickened, and he tried to shake off the feeling. He couldn't let her intimidate him. But as he walked into class, the reality of the situation sank in. He was no longer just fighting Janet, he was fighting an entire system that was determined to protect her. By lunchtime, Trey was feeling drained. The cafeteria was as chaotic as usual, but to him, it felt suffocating. He spotted Janet sitting at her usual spot, surrounded by her friends. They were all laughing, all of them in on the same joke. Trey knew that Janet had spun the narrative in her favor. It wasn't just about the lie anymore, it was about who had the power to control the story. And right now, Janet had that power. He sat at his usual table with Jordan, trying to keep his cool. But even Jordan seemed distant, like he wasn't sure how to help. The tension was palpable. "I talked to some people this morning," Jordan said quietly, leaning in. "Janet's dad is really pushing the principal to take action against you. Word is, they're trying to find a way to expel you. It's getting serious." Trey's chest tightened at the mention of expulsion. His future was on the line, and he felt like he was caught in a battle he couldn't win. "I don't care if they try to expel me. I didn't do anything wrong. This is all because of her. She's the one who started the lies." Jordan looked hesitant. "I know, man. But I don't think the school's going to see it that way. And with her mom pulling strings, you're going to need more than just the truth to get through this." Trey clenched his fists under the table. He could feel the frustration building, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of determination. If Janet thought she could get away with this, she was wrong. He wasn't just going to let her destroy him. He had to fight back, and not just in the schoolyard. "I'm going to go talk to the principal," Trey said, his voice steady. "I'm not going to let them do this to me. I'll tell my side of the story, and I'll make sure they know the truth." Jordan looked at him, concern etched on his face. "Trey, I get that you want to clear your name, but you need to be careful. Ms. Collins is a force to be reckoned with. She's got connections everywhere, and if you're not careful, you'll be playing right into their hands." Trey stared at Jordan for a long moment, contemplating his words. Jordan was right. It wasn't just about the truth anymore. It was about power, influence, and who could manipulate the system. But Trey couldn't just sit back and let them win. He had to do something. "I have to do this," Trey said, his voice resolute. "I'm not going to let them sweep this under the rug. It's my life, and I'm going to fight for it." The next day, Trey made his way to the principal's office. He had called ahead to set up a meeting, and now, with his heart racing, he was about to face the man who held the power to decide his future. Principal Thompson was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s. He was known for being fair but strict. Trey had always respected him, but today, as he sat across from him, the principal seemed like another obstacle in his path. "Mr. Williams, I understand you've requested to speak with me," Principal Thompson said, his voice calm but firm. "What's this all about?" Trey's throat felt dry, but he pushed through it. "I want to clear my name, sir. There are some things going on that I don't think you know about, and I need you to understand the truth. Janet Collins has been spreading lies about me, and I'm not going to let her ruin my reputation." Principal Thompson didn't react immediately. He just stared at Trey for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm aware of the situation, Mr. Williams. And I've spoken with Mrs. Collins. She's quite concerned about her daughter's well-being, as you can imagine. Trey clenched his fists. That's exactly the problem. Mrs. Collins is using her influence to paint me as the bad guy. I've done nothing wrong. I was just trying to stand up for myself. The principal leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face. I understand that you're upset, Trey. But this is a serious accusation. If we're going to move forward with this, I'm going to need evidence, something concrete that shows Mrs. Collins' claims are false. Trey's heart sank. He had nothing but his word, and right now, that didn't seem like enough. I don't have any proof, Trey said, his voice tinged with frustration. But I'm telling you, I didn't do anything wrong. Janet lied about me, and now it's becoming something bigger than it should be. I'm not asking for a favor, I'm just asking for a fair chance to tell my side of the story. Principal Thompson studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. I hear you, Trey. But until there's something more concrete, there's not much I can do. You'll have to be patient. Trey stood up, his frustration bubbling over. So you're just going to let her and her mom win? You're not going to do anything to help me? Principal Thompson's expression hardened. I'm not saying that, but there are procedures we have to follow. I'll look into the situation more thoroughly. In the meantime, I suggest you focus on your studies and avoid further confrontation with Ms. Collins. Trey felt a surge of anger but swallowed it down. He wasn't going to let this defeat him. Fine. But I'm not going to let this go. You'll see. As he left the office, Trey's mind raced. The principal wasn't going to act without proof, and right now, it felt like there was no way to prove that Janet had started the rumors. But Trey wasn't going to give up. He had one more card to play, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Trey had never felt so conflicted. As he sat at home that evening, trying to study, his thoughts kept wandering back to his meeting with Principal Thompson. The conversation had been frustrating, to say the least. The principal had been cordial, but his hands were tied by the rules and protocols. Trey had to face it, he was on his own for now. But one thing he knew for sure, this fight wasn't over. He had to keep pushing. That night, Trey sat at his desk, the weight of everything pressing on him. He could hear his mom, Tasha, in the kitchen, humming as she prepared dinner. But no matter how much he tried to focus on the pages in front of him, his mind kept drifting back to Janet and her seemingly endless influence. He picked up his phone and started typing a message to Jordan. He needed to talk to someone who understood what he was going through. Man, I don't know what else to do. I talked to the principal today, and he basically told me to wait for evidence. But how am I supposed to prove what's going on? It didn't take long for Jordan to respond. I get it, man. But you've got to stay patient. They're trying to wear you down, but you can't let them. You're in the right, and eventually, people will see that. Just keep your head up. The truth will come out. Trey stared at the screen for a long moment. He appreciated Jordan's support, but he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. How much longer could he just sit back and wait? Janet had already started to turn people against him, and the longer he let her control the narrative, the more damage she would do. Trey set his phone down and stood up, walking over to the window. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the neighborhood. But inside, everything felt dark. He could see the distant outline of Janet's house, just a few blocks away. She lived in one of the bigger homes in their neighborhood, her family's wealth obvious in every aspect of their lives. Trey had never cared about money, but in moments like these, it felt like it mattered more than anything. Janet had the power to manipulate the situation. Her family had the resources to make sure the truth never came to light. That was when it hit him. If he couldn't prove the truth with the evidence he had, maybe he could get someone to help him. Someone with authority. Someone who could level the playing field. The next day, Trey decided to take a risk. He was done sitting idly by, hoping someone would come to his rescue. He had an idea, one that had been simmering in his mind ever since his conversation with Principal Thompson. It wasn't just about fighting Janet's lies anymore, it was about exposing the truth, no matter what. Trey called his mom after school. Tasha answered quickly, her voice warm but with a trace of concern. "Hey, sweetie. How was your day?" "Mom, I need your help," Trey said without preamble. "I've got to talk to someone who can make things happen. I don't have enough proof to convince Principal Thompson, but I know someone who can help us. Someone who's got the connections we need." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "Who do you have in mind?" "I need to talk to an attorney, someone who's used to dealing with situations like this. I think we need legal help. This isn't just about school anymore. If I can't clear my name through the principal, we're going to need someone who knows how to fight back legally. Someone who can help expose what Janet and her family are trying to do." Tasha was quiet for a moment before responding, her voice steady but cautious. "I think you're right. This is getting out of hand. I'll make a few calls tonight." "You don't have to do this alone, Trey." "I know, Mom. I just can't sit back and let her destroy everything." Tasha's voice softened. "You've got a strong head on your shoulders, Trey. We'll figure this out." That evening, Tasha made good on her promise. She called a friend who worked with a law firm, and within an hour, Trey was sitting in their living room, waiting for an attorney to arrive. He felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. This was the next step, he was no longer playing by the school's rules. This was real, and it was about to get even more complicated. The doorbell rang, and Trey's heart skipped a beat. Tasha opened the door to reveal a tall man in his 40s, dressed in a professional suit. His short cropped hair was graying at the temples, and his sharp eyes gave off an air of authority. Trey stood up as the man entered, extending his hand. "You must be Trey," the man said with a firm handshake. "I'm Mark Davis. Your mother's told me a little about the situation. Let's talk." Tasha led them to the living room, where they all sat down. Mark Davis pulled out a notepad and pen, preparing to take notes. "Now, Trey," Mark began, "I need you to tell me everything. Every detail. I want to understand exactly what's been happening so we can move forward." Trey took a deep breath and began to recount everything that had happened, from the incident at the mall to the fallout at school. He told Mark about Janet's accusations, how her mother had become involved, and how Principal Thompson seemed hesitant to act without concrete proof. He explained how the situation had escalated, how people were turning on him, and how Janet's lies were now shaping the narrative. Mark listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes, his expression thoughtful. "This is a tricky situation," he said finally. "It sounds like you're caught in the middle of a personal vendetta. And with Janet's family being so connected, I'm sure this won't be easy. But don't worry, we'll figure this out. The key here is making sure we get ahead of the story. If we can show that this was all a setup, we'll have a chance to clear your name." Trey's chest tightened. "How are we going to do that? I don't have any proof. Janet has everyone believing her." Mark leaned forward. "We don't need physical proof right now. What we need is a strategy. First, we need to start gathering as much information as possible. We'll talk to people who were there at the mall that day, get their statements. We'll also need to look into Janet's past. This isn't just about one event, it's about building a case that shows this isn't the first time something like this has happened." Trey felt a surge of hope. This was the first time in a while that someone had offered a real solution. Mark knew what he was talking about, and that made Trey feel like he wasn't fighting alone anymore. "We'll also want to talk to Principal Thompson again," Mark continued. "But we're going to approach him with more than just your side of the story. We'll have a full plan, a way to prove that Janet's accusations don't hold up. Trey nodded, a new sense of determination settling in. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a chance. This wasn't just a high school drama. This was a fight for his future, and he was ready to take it to the next level. The following days were a whirlwind. Mark Davis and his firm began working on Trey's case, reaching out to potential witnesses and preparing a strategy. Trey didn't have the luxury of time, and every moment counted. But the more he learned from Mark, the more confident he felt. He wasn't alone in this anymore. And for the first time, he felt like he had the power to change the course of his story. Janet and her family had underestimated him. They thought they could ruin him with lies and intimidation. But Trey was fighting back. He was no longer just a victim of their manipulation. He was going to expose the truth. And soon, Janet would learn just how dangerous it was to mess with someone who wasn't afraid to fight back. The battle was only getting started. Trey had spent the past few days trying to concentrate on his schoolwork, but it felt impossible. Every time he sat down to read or write, his mind drifted back to the looming confrontation with Janet. He knew that everything was building up to one final showdown, one moment that could either clear his name or destroy everything he had worked for. But with Mark Davis handling the legal side of things, Trey couldn't help but feel the anxiety rising. It was Thursday afternoon when the phone call came. Trey had just finished his last class of the day, and he was walking to the parking lot when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. "Hello," Trey said, his voice tight with anticipation. "Trey Williams." The voice on the other end was a woman's, authoritative but calm. "This is Detective Shaw from the police department. I'm calling regarding an ongoing investigation related to the incident at the mall involving Janet Collins." Trey's breath caught in his throat. "What investigation?" he asked, his pulse quickening. "We've received reports that there may be some inconsistencies in the statements made by Ms. Collins regarding the events that transpired," Detective Shaw continued. "We're currently looking into it, and we'd like to get your side of the story." Trey's mind raced. Was this it? Was this the break he had been hoping for? Yes, of course," Trey said, trying to stay calm. "I'll do whatever I can to help." Detective Shaw paused for a moment before continuing. "I understand. I'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow for a brief interview. It's part of our investigation. I'll send you the details." "Thank you," Trey replied, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "I'll be there." The next day, Trey stood in front of the local police station, trying to suppress the nerves that had crept up on him. This was it, his chance to finally turn the tables on Janet. After weeks of uncertainty, of feeling powerless, he was about to take the first real step toward clearing his name. His mom, Tasha, had insisted on coming with him, and Trey was grateful for the support. They entered the building together, and after a brief check-in at the front desk, Trey was led to an interrogation room. It was small and sterile, with a long metal table in the center and a couple of uncomfortable chairs. Trey sat down, his hands clammy. Detective Shaw entered a few minutes later, holding a clipboard and a file. She was in her mid-30s, with short cropped hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She sat across from Trey and gave him a nod. "Mr. Williams, thank you for coming in. I know this situation has been difficult for you," she said, her voice professional but not unkind. "I want to assure you that this is just routine. We're trying to get to the bottom of what happened that day at the mall." Trey nodded. "I'm ready to tell you everything. I just want to make sure people know the truth." Detective Shaw opened the file and glanced down at her notes. "I understand. Let's start with your side of the story. Can you walk me through what happened?" Trey took a deep breath and began recounting the entire ordeal, from the moment he had seen Janet at the mall to the argument that had spiraled out of control. He told her about the heated exchange and how Janet had accused him of threatening her. He emphasized the fact that he had never intended to hurt her and that he had simply been trying to defend himself when she became aggressive. As he spoke, he noticed Detective Shaw taking notes, her expression neutral. He wasn't sure whether she believed him yet, but he wasn't going to stop until he had said everything he needed to say. "I just don't understand why she's doing this," Trey continued. "I don't know if it's because I stood up for myself or if she just wanted to get me in trouble, but I didn't do anything wrong." Detective Shaw looked up from her notes, her eyes meeting Trey's. "I'm not here to judge, Mr. Williams. I'm just trying to get the facts. Do you have any idea why Ms. Collins might have made these accusations?" Trey hesitated. "I mean, I think it has something to do with her wanting to get back at me. She's always been, kind of manipulative. But I never thought she'd go this far." Detective Shaw nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Well, we'll continue to investigate. For now, I think we have what we need. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Williams. We'll be in touch." Trey stood up, his mind spinning. He had done everything he could to help clear his name, but now the waiting game began again. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. The next day at school, Trey could feel the tension hanging in the air. The rumors were still swirling, but there was a subtle shift. People seemed more cautious around him, like they were waiting for something to happen. He knew the investigation was still in the early stages, but the fact that the police were involved had already made a big impact. Trey wasn't sure if it would be enough to bring down Janet's facade, but it was a start. At lunch, Jordan slid into the seat across from Trey, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Dude, I heard about the interview with the cops. How did it go?" he asked in a low voice. Trey shrugged. "I think it went well. I told them everything, but they're still investigating. I don't know what's going to happen next, but at least it feels like I'm doing something." Jordan gave him a supportive smile. "I told you, man. You've got this. They can't keep lying about you forever." Trey forced a smile. He wanted to believe Jordan, but deep down, he knew that Janet's influence was still strong. He couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. But then, as if the universe was playing a cruel joke, Trey's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his mom. "Trey, you need to come home right now. I just got a call from Mark Davis. There's been a development." Trey's heart skipped a beat. The pit in his stomach deepened. "What now?" He stood up quickly, grabbing his things. "I've got to go. I'll text you later, man." Jordan raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything as Trey hurried out of the cafeteria. The weight of uncertainty hung over him as he rushed out of school and into his mom's car. Tasha was waiting for him outside when he arrived, her face tight with concern. She didn't say anything as she drove him home. The silence was thick, and Trey's mind raced with possibilities. What kind of development had Mark Davis uncovered? When they got home, Mark was already there, waiting for them in the living room. His expression was serious, but there was a glimmer of something else in his eyes, something that told Trey they were on the verge of something big. Mark didn't waste time getting to the point. "We've just received some new information. It looks like Janet's story is unraveling faster than we thought." Trey's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What happened?" Mark leaned forward. "We've found evidence that Janet may have fabricated parts of her story. We're in the process of gathering more, but we're getting closer to proving that she's been lying all along." Trey felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered by a gnawing fear. They weren't out of the woods yet. There was still a long road ahead. "This isn't over," Mark continued, his voice firm. "But we've got the momentum now. We're going to take this to the next level." Trey nodded, determination flooding through him. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, he was ready. The next few days felt like an emotional roller coaster. Trey could hardly focus on anything except the investigation. Every time he picked up his phone, he half expected it to ring with news that could either free him or bury him deeper. Even though Mark Davis had given him hope, there was a part of Trey that couldn't shake the anxiety. The stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about defending his reputation, it was about exposing Janet for the manipulative liar she was. Trey walked through the halls of school on Monday morning, trying to keep his head down. He couldn't ignore the stares, the whispers, the looks of sympathy from some students and the cold indifference from others. Janet had made sure everyone knew her version of the story. She'd planted the seed in their minds, and now it was up to Trey to prove her wrong. He found Jordan waiting by their usual spot in the courtyard. His friend was sitting with his arms crossed, looking unusually tense. "Hey, you good?" Trey asked, sitting down next to him. Jordan nodded but didn't speak immediately. There was an uncomfortable pause before he finally spoke. "You know the cops are looking into things, right?" Trey raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, I know. I spoke with Detective Shaw last week." Jordan glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Well, someone tipped off the media. Word's getting around that there's an investigation into Janet. I heard a few people say she's been acting really weird lately, like she's trying to cover something up." Trey felt his stomach twist. He hadn't expected the story to go public so soon, and he wasn't sure how he felt about the media getting involved. This could either be a blessing or a curse. "Is that good or bad?" Trey asked, trying to keep his tone light. "It could be both. It's good because it'll put pressure on Janet. But it's bad because, well, you know how people like to spin things. The story could get twisted, and it might be harder to control." Trey took a deep breath, trying to process what Jordan had just said. The weight of everything was starting to feel too much, too fast. But there was no turning back now. "I just want it to be over," Trey muttered. "I want people to know the truth. I'm so tired of being in the dark." Jordan gave him a firm slap on the back. "I know, man. But you've got this. You've got people behind you. It'll all work out." But as Trey watched his friend walk off to class, he couldn't help but feel the gnawing doubt creeping in. Things were escalating quickly, and he had no control over where they were heading. Later that day, Trey found himself standing in front of Principal Thompson's office once again. This time, it was different. This time, the power was shifting. Trey had come to a realization: he couldn't wait for things to happen. He needed to make them happen. So, with newfound resolve, he knocked on the door and entered. Principal Thompson was seated at his desk, looking over some paperwork. He looked up when Trey entered, and his expression softened. "Ah, Trey. What brings you by today?" Trey stood tall, trying to steady his nerves. He had come here for a reason. "I need to talk to you about Janet Collins," he said, his voice firm. Principal Thompson set down the papers and gave him a questioning look. "What about her? I think you need to reconsider the way you're handling the situation. There's more going on here than you know. Janet's been lying about what happened at the mall, and I'm not the only one who's been affected." The principal's brow furrowed. "I'm aware that there are rumors, Trey, but without clear evidence. I don't need rumors. I've already given you my side of the story. I've told you what happened. And now the police are involved. This isn't just about her word versus mine anymore." Trey could feel the tension rising as he spoke, but he wasn't about to back down. He couldn't afford to. Principal Thompson's expression became serious. "You're telling me that the police are involved now?" Trey nodded. "Yes. Detective Shaw has been investigating what happened. And I'm telling you right now, there's a lot more to the story. Janet isn't telling the truth." The principal sighed, rubbing his temples. "Trey, I don't want to see anyone hurt by this. I want to get to the truth just as much as you do. But I also need to follow protocol. I can't just take one side without evidence. I get that, Trey said, his voice quieter now. But you need to understand that this isn't just a school issue. This is bigger than that. I'm being accused of something I didn't do, and Janet's getting away with it. There was a long pause before Principal Thompson spoke again, his tone softer. I hear you, Trey. And I'll do what I can to help. But we need to wait for the investigation to unfold. I'll make sure the school does everything it can to support you in the meantime. Trey nodded, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had said what he needed to say, but the uncertainty of it all still lingered. That night, Trey was sitting at the kitchen table, going over his notes from the meeting with Principal Thompson when his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him he should answer. Hello. Trey, this is Detective Shaw. I've got news. His heart skipped a beat. What's going on? There's been a development. We've uncovered some new evidence that points to Janet's involvement in an ongoing scheme to manipulate the truth. We've also spoken to a few people who were at the mall that day who corroborate your side of the story. Trey could hardly believe what he was hearing. You're sure? I'm sure. We're still gathering details, but it looks like the evidence is stacking up in your favor. We've also found a pattern of Janet trying to discredit people who've crossed her in the past. This isn't the first time she's done something like this. Trey let out a long breath, a sense of relief flooding through him. But then, just as quickly, the reality of the situation hit him again. They were close, but they weren't there yet. Thank you, Trey said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for believing me. You're welcome, Detective Shaw replied. But this isn't over yet. We still have more work to do. Stay focused. As Trey hung up the phone, his mom entered the room. Her eyes searched his face, waiting for him to speak. Is everything okay? She asked. Trey turned to her, a tired but triumphant smile crossing his face. Yeah. It's starting to look like we might actually win this thing. Janet's lies are finally starting to catch up with her. Tasha sighed in relief and sat down next to him. I knew you could do it, Trey. It's just going to take some time. Trey nodded, but deep down, he knew the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Janet wasn't going to give up without a fight, and there were still plenty of obstacles ahead. But for the first time in a long while, Trey felt like he had the upper hand. He was going to make sure that when the truth came out, it would be impossible to ignore. And Janet Collins was going to learn that nothing, not her wealth, not her lies, not her power, could save her from the truth. The days that followed were a blur of activity, both at school and outside of it. Trey tried to focus on his studies, but the weight of the situation was hard to shake. Every time he sat down at his desk, his thoughts would wander to the investigation, to Janet's lies, and to the growing evidence that seemed to be turning the tide in his favor. It was surreal, really. It felt like everything was moving so quickly, and yet, so slowly at the same time. School had become a minefield of glances and whispers. Trey couldn't walk down the hallway without hearing the faint murmur of gossip behind him. He overheard snippets of conversations that only deepened the pit in his stomach. Some students were siding with Janet, some with him, and others, those who didn't know the full story, were still just trying to pick a side. Trey tried not to let it bother him, but it did. Every look, every word, every moment where people acted like they were talking about him, it all weighed on his shoulders. And Janet? Janet was nowhere to be seen at school. She hadn't shown up for 2 days, and rumor had it she was dealing with family issues. Trey didn't know whether to believe it or not. Part of him wondered if she was laying low, hoping the heat would die down. But for Trey, there was no going back to normal. Not anymore. That evening, Trey was sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone when he received another unexpected call. His heart skipped as he saw the name on the screen. Mark Davis. Hello. Trey answered, trying to sound casual, though his mind was racing. Hey, Trey. It's Mark. I need you to meet me tomorrow morning. There's been a significant update in your case, and I want to go over some things with you, Mark said, his voice steady but urgent. Trey's pulse quickened. What's going on? Is it good news? It's promising, but I need you to be prepared. There's still a lot we need to work through. I'll explain everything when we meet. Let's just say we're moving into a new phase of the investigation. Trey nodded, even though Mark couldn't see him. Got it. I'll be there. The next morning, Trey met with Mark at his office. He was nervous, but there was also a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. When he entered Mark's office, he could see the lawyer was reviewing a thick folder of documents, his expression focused but not as tense as it had been in the past. Trey took a seat across from him, trying to steady his nerves. So, what's the deal? Trey asked, unable to hold back his curiosity. Mark placed the folder on the desk and pushed it toward Trey. I've been going through the evidence we've gathered, and I think we finally have the smoking gun we need. We've managed to track down some critical information that should completely dismantle Janet's version of events. Trey leaned forward, his eyes scanning the folder. What is it? What did you find? Mark smiled slightly. We've uncovered communication between Janet and a few friends of hers. In one of the messages, she directly referenced getting Trey in trouble and making sure he's expelled. It's clear that her intentions were to frame you, to make sure you were accused of something you didn't do. Trey felt his heart race. This was huge. If they could prove that Janet had deliberately set him up, it would change everything. But that's not all, Mark continued. We also found evidence that Janet was in contact with a local journalist, and she may have been feeding them information to sway public opinion in her favor. She's been playing the media just as much as she's been manipulating people at school. Trey's mind spun as he processed the information. It was more than he had ever hoped for, and yet, it still didn't feel like enough. Janet was clever. She had resources. She had a way of getting out of tight situations. Do you think this is enough to take her down? Trey asked cautiously. Mark's smile faltered slightly, but he kept his voice steady. It's enough to make a strong case. But we're not there yet. I'm going to present this evidence to the DA in the next few days, and if they agree, we can start moving forward with charges. Trey nodded, the weight of it all crashing down on him. This was real now. This wasn't just a fight for his reputation anymore. This was about justice. And Janet was going to pay for what she'd done. The next few days felt like a blur as the investigation continued. Trey kept a low profile, focusing on his classes, but every so often, he would catch a glimpse of Janet in the halls. She was still keeping her distance, but it was clear that she was trying to maintain her status at school. Trey's mind was constantly racing. Every piece of evidence they uncovered made it feel like they were closer to the truth, but with every step forward, the fear of what Janet might do next gnawed at him. He wasn't naive. He knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. She had too much to lose. On Thursday, after school, Trey received another call. This time, it was from Detective Shaw. Trey, we've got a breakthrough, she said, her voice tight. We've confirmed that Janet was in direct contact with a member of the school administration. We've also found records of meetings between her and a few other individuals who are trying to discredit you. This has gone beyond just her targeting you. It's clear that she's been manipulating people in positions of power for a while. Trey's heart dropped. Wait, what? Are you saying she's been controlling things at the school too? It seems that way, Detective Shaw replied. There are emails, text messages, we've even found a couple of recordings. Janet has been using her influence to get people on her side. But the good news is, we've got enough to expose her now. Trey felt a surge of anger but quickly tamped it down. This was it. This was the moment they could end it all. "I'm going to need you to come in again for a formal statement," Detective Shaw continued. "We want to get everything on record, so we can bring this to the DA." Trey nodded. "I'll be there. I'll do whatever it takes." The following afternoon, Trey sat across from Detective Shaw once more. This time, it was different. The air in the room was heavy with the realization that the pieces were finally falling into place. "Let's get started," Detective Shaw said as she began taking notes. "Tell me everything you know about Janet's involvement with the school and the people she's been manipulating." Trey recounted the entire situation, everything from the initial confrontation with Janet at the mall to the way she had turned people against him at school. He spoke about the emails, the rumors, and everything that had been part of her campaign to ruin his life. As he spoke, he could see that Detective Shaw was taking everything down carefully. Her expression was serious, but Trey could sense that she believed him. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a person with a voice, someone whose story was finally being heard. "We'll take it from here," Detective Shaw said when he finished. "The investigation is almost over. The evidence we've gathered is overwhelming. We'll be filing charges against Janet Collins soon. You've done your part, Trey." Trey's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of those words sank in. Janet was going down. And Trey was finally going to be free. When Trey arrived home that night, his mom was waiting for him in the living room, her face etched with concern. She stood as he entered, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Trey, what happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. "What did they say?" Trey gave her a tired but determined smile. "It's over, Mom. Janet's going to pay for what she did. The DA's going to file charges, and the truth is finally coming out." Tasha's eyes filled with relief. She pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly as if to reassure herself that this nightmare was finally ending. But even as she held him, Trey knew the real fight wasn't over yet. They still had to go through the court process, and Janet wasn't the type to give up easily. But for the first time in a long while, Trey felt like he could breathe. This was just the beginning. The next few days were quieter than Trey had expected. He had been bracing himself for a whirlwind of media attention, backlash from Janet's supporters, and possibly even an attempt at retaliation from her. But surprisingly, things seemed to have slowed down. The whispers at school didn't seem as loud, and the rumor mill had quieted a bit. Even Janet had stayed out of sight, keeping a low profile and leaving Trey with a strange sense of unease. Despite the calm, Trey knew this was just the eye of the storm. The real challenge was still ahead. The news about the investigation would eventually break, and when it did, things would get intense. He had no illusions that Janet would go down without a fight. She was dangerous when cornered, and Trey wasn't sure what lengths she would go to in order to save herself. But for now, Trey tried to stay focused. His mom, Tasha, was helping him get through the emotional roller coaster. She had been a constant source of support, and she was starting to feel a glimmer of hope too. It had been a long, exhausting road, but they were finally getting closer to the truth. The following Monday, Trey arrived at school with a mix of apprehension and anticipation. As he walked through the front doors, he noticed a group of students gathered around the bulletin board in the hallway. Trey's stomach dropped as he saw a familiar face in the crowd, Janet's best friend, Caroline. The two girls had been inseparable since middle school, and Caroline had been one of Janet's biggest supporters in the weeks leading up to the investigation. If Caroline was involved in whatever was happening now, it wasn't going to be good for Trey. Trey kept his head down and tried to pass by unnoticed, but as he did, he overheard snippets of conversation. Words like court, charges, and Janet sighed floated through the air, catching his attention. His pulse quickened as he slowed down to listen more closely. "I heard they're going to charge Janet with something serious," Caroline was saying, her voice laced with worry. "I don't know how anyone can believe Trey over her. She's been through enough already. This is all just so messed up." Trey's heart pounded as he realized what was going on. The rumors had started again. Janet was still trying to control the narrative, and she was leaning heavily on her best friend to back her up. Trey could practically hear the wheels turning in Caroline's head as she worked on spinning the story. She was going to do everything in her power to protect Janet, no matter what the evidence said. Trey's hand clenched into a fist as the anger surged within him. How many more people was Janet going to drag into this? How many more lies was she going to spread to keep herself out of trouble? As he stood there, trying to calm his racing thoughts, a voice interrupted him. "Hey, Trey." He turned to see Mark Davis, his lawyer, standing behind him, looking calm and collected as always. "What's up?" Trey asked, trying to keep his cool despite the chaos around him. "I need to talk to you for a minute," Mark said, his voice low. "Let's go somewhere private." Trey followed Mark down the hallway, feeling his nerves tighten. Something wasn't right. He could sense the tension in Mark's tone. They ducked into a small, unused classroom, and Trey immediately noticed how serious Mark looked. "Okay, what's going on?" Trey asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Mark glanced around to make sure they were alone, then spoke in a quiet but firm tone. "We've got a problem." Trey felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean? Is it Janet?" Mark nodded. "Yes, and no. I've just received word that Janet and her family have hired a very powerful lawyer. Someone who specializes in making high-profile cases like this disappear. This is not going to be an easy fight. We're talking about a lawyer who can twist the truth, manipulate evidence, and make the case seem like it's all one big misunderstanding. Janet's parents have deep pockets, and they're pulling out all the stops." Trey's stomach sank. "You mean she's going to try to bury the truth? After everything?" Mark met Trey's eyes. "Yes. She's not going down without a fight. This lawyer is dangerous, and if we're not careful, they could turn the entire case upside down. I'm warning you now, this is about to get messy." Trey felt the weight of Mark's words settle on him. He had always known that Janet wasn't going to give up easily, but this was next level. She had the resources, the connections, and now, a lawyer who could pull every dirty trick in the book. "Are you saying there's nothing we can do?" Trey asked, his voice desperate. Mark gave him a steady look. "No. There's plenty we can do. But we need to be prepared for the fight of our lives. Janet is going to pull out every weapon she can. We just have to make sure we stay one step ahead of her." Trey's mind was racing, but he nodded. "Okay. What's the next step?" "We stay calm, stay focused, and make sure we have every piece of evidence we need," Mark said. "I'll be in touch with the DA's office later this week. We need to push hard, but we also need to be ready for Janet's counterattack. She's going to try to make you look like the villain, and we need to make sure she can't get away with it." Trey felt his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment when everything could fall apart, or when it could all come together. Janet had power, but Trey had something she didn't, the truth. "I'm ready," Trey said, his voice steady. "I'm not backing down." Mark smiled slightly. "Good. We're in this together." That evening, Trey sat down with his mom to discuss everything. His mind was still spinning from his conversation with Mark, but he knew he needed to prepare himself for what was coming. This wasn't just about defending himself anymore. This was about standing up for what was right, no matter how hard it would be. "I'm scared, Mom," Trey admitted, his voice shaking as he looked at her. Tasha reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I know, baby. I know. But you're not alone in this. You've got me. You've got your friends. And most importantly, you've got the truth. That's the one thing Janet can never take from you." Trey looked up at her, feeling a surge of determination. For the first time in a while, he felt like he could win this. He wasn't going to let Janet destroy everything he had worked for. The fight wasn't over yet, but it was far from lost. "Thanks, Mom," Trey whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. She smiled at him, and for the first time, he saw something more than worry in her eyes. She was proud of him. And that meant everything. The storm was coming, but Trey was ready to face it. The truth would win. And nothing Janet did could change that. The following days felt like a pressure cooker, with tension building steadily as the investigation progressed. Trey's school life continued to be a mix of stares and whispers, but he was no longer as shaken by them. He had bigger things to focus on. With Janet's new powerful lawyer now in the picture, Trey knew that the stakes had been raised higher than ever. His confidence, however, remained unwavering. He was determined to see this through, no matter how tough things got. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Mark Davis called him with news that would change everything. "Hey, Trey. We've got a court date," Mark said, his voice grim but firm. "It's been set for next month. Janet's lawyers have agreed to push forward, and they want to settle this quickly. We'll need to be ready, and I mean ready." Trey's stomach turned. The news was both a relief and a weighty burden. A court date meant things were moving forward, but it also meant everything was about to become public. The idea of his life being spread across newspapers and social media made him uneasy. He had spent months just trying to get through each day, and now it was all coming to a head. "When is it?" Trey asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Next month, the 15th, mark your calendar, because everything's going to hit the fan around then. I'm already gathering all the evidence we can find. We'll meet to go over everything before the hearing." Trey felt a knot tighten in his chest. The next month was going to be filled with preparation, sleepless nights, and non-stop work. But it also meant the truth would finally come to light. As the days passed, the reality of what was ahead set in. Trey threw himself into his studies and kept his head down at school. He focused on trying to be a normal teenager, even though the weight of everything was constantly hanging over him. It wasn't easy. His reputation was still on the line, and the stress was beginning to wear on him. But each day that passed meant one day closer to the truth coming out, and Trey clung to that. At school, the situation continued to evolve. Caroline, Janet's best friend, had grown more vocal in her support of Janet, claiming that Trey was simply trying to ruin Janet's life with fabricated lies. The rumors around school flared up again, but this time, Trey didn't flinch. He had already been through the worst of it, and now he was determined to keep his composure. He tried his best to ignore the whispers that followed him between classes, the sideways glances that followed his every move. But it wasn't easy. Caroline had done a good job of rallying people to Janet's side, making it seem like Trey was the villain in all of this. And while some of the students had begun to show support for him, there were still enough that took Janet's side to make it feel like a battle he couldn't win. He often found himself wondering if the truth would be enough to break the grip Janet had on the school's reputation. Or if, in the end, her manipulations would prove too strong. Then, on the following Friday, everything took another unexpected turn. Trey was sitting at lunch when Caroline approached him, her expression hard but not as fiery as usual. She stood in front of him, arms crossed over her chest. "You know, Trey," Caroline started, her voice sharp, "I never wanted to believe all this stuff about you. I thought Janet was just overreacting. But now that I see how far you've taken this, you really don't care about ruining her, do you?" Trey looked up at her, refusing to let her words rattle him. "I'm not trying to ruin anyone's life, Caroline. I'm just trying to tell the truth. Your best friend did something awful, and now she's trying to cover it up." Caroline shook her head, her gaze narrowing. "You're delusional. You've already turned enough people against her. What else do you want?" Trey stood up, matching her intensity. "I'm not doing anything except telling the truth. If you want to keep protecting someone who's hurting other people, that's your choice. But I'm not backing down. For a moment, Caroline seemed to hesitate. Then, with a shrug, she turned and walked away, leaving Trey standing there, his heart pounding in his chest. The encounter left him feeling drained. He could see that no matter how hard he tried, some people would never believe the truth. Janet had a way of getting into people's heads, making them see things the way she wanted them to. But he couldn't let that discourage him. He couldn't let Janet win, not when he was this close to proving his innocence. As the court date loomed closer, Trey's life became a blur of meetings with Mark, Detective Shaw, and his mom. They combed through every piece of evidence, reviewed every witness statement, and prepared Trey for the possibility of testifying. The closer they got to the 15th, the more he felt the pressure building. He knew what was at stake. It wasn't just his reputation, it was his entire future. And while he knew the odds were in his favor, there was still a nagging doubt in the back of his mind. What if Janet pulled something out of nowhere? What if her new lawyer had some trick up their sleeve that could turn the tide? Every night, he would lie awake, replaying the events in his head, wondering if there was anything more he could have done. But deep down, he knew that he had already done everything he could. The truth was on his side. It had to be enough. One particularly stressful afternoon, after another meeting with Mark, Trey returned home to find his mom sitting at the kitchen table with an unreadable expression on her face. She looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with concern. "Trey, we need to talk," she said quietly. Trey stopped in his tracks, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. "What is it, Mom? What happened?" Tasha looked at him, her expression both proud and worried. "I just got off the phone with the DA. The court date is confirmed, but there's something else. Janet's lawyer has filed a request for a delay. They're claiming that there's new evidence that hasn't been processed yet." Trey's stomach dropped. What kind of new evidence? Is she just stalling? Tasha nodded. It looks like it. They're trying to buy more time, hoping they can find something to shift the momentum in their favor. But, Trey, you have to stay strong. This is part of the game. They'll try anything to derail things. But we can't let them. Trey's heart pounded. Janet wasn't going to make this easy. She was going to drag things out, use every legal loophole to delay the truth from coming out. But Trey couldn't let that stop him. He wasn't going to let her win by playing dirty tricks. He would keep fighting, no matter what. "Let them try," Trey said, his voice filled with determination. "I'm not backing down." Tasha smiled at him, her pride in him evident. "I know you're not. And neither am I." As Trey prepared for the final stretch of the battle, he knew the storm wasn't over yet. But for the first time, he felt like he was ready. Janet had underestimated him. And now, it was time to take her down. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Trey felt like he was walking through a fog. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of preparation, legal strategizing, and personal reflection. He had been ready for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare him for the emotional weight of standing in front of a judge, ready to tell his story. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about putting an end to the nightmare that had hung over his life for so long. Trey sat in the small waiting room with his mom, Mark, and Detective Shaw, all of them dressed in their best, trying to appear calm, despite the storm brewing in their hearts. The room was sterile and cold, with metal chairs that scraped across the floor as they adjusted. His mom sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee, offering silent comfort. "You okay?" Tasha asked, her voice quiet. Trey nodded, but the truth was, he wasn't. His heart raced in his chest, and his palms were sweating. This was the moment everything had been building up to. He had always hoped this day would never come, that the truth would somehow come out before it reached this point. But now that it had, he couldn't help but feel like everything in his life had led to this singular event. His future, his reputation, everything he had worked for, was on the line. Mark gave him a reassuring smile. "Remember, Trey. You've done everything you can. Just stick to the truth. They can't argue with that. Trey appreciated the sentiment, but he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his stomach. The only thing that kept him grounded was the thought of the truth. He knew that if he just stuck to what happened, nothing Janet or her lawyer could say would change the reality of it. The door to the courtroom opened, and a court clerk called them inside. Trey stood up, feeling a sense of finality wash over him. It was time. The courtroom was intimidating. The wooden paneling, the polished mahogany furniture, and the stern faces of the judge and jury made everything feel real. This was no longer just an argument between teenagers, it was a legal battle with real consequences. As Trey walked to the witness stand, his heart pounded in his chest. His hands gripped the edges of the chair as he sat down, the sound of his heartbeat deafening in his ears. His eyes flickered to the other side of the room, where Janet sat with her lawyer, looking as confident as ever. Janet's lawyer was a tall, imposing figure with sharp features and a cold, calculating gaze. Trey couldn't help but notice how carefully she watched him, like a predator sizing up her prey. The judge, an older woman with glasses perched on her nose, glanced at Trey and gave a nod. Please state your full name for the record. Trey Alexander Johnson, he replied, his voice steady despite the nerves coiling in his stomach. The judge gave him a short nod. You may proceed with your testimony. Mark stood beside him, giving him an encouraging look before he began speaking. Trey, tell the court what happened on the day you were accused by Janet Carlton. Trey took a deep breath, feeling the eyes of the jury on him. His mind raced for a moment, then the words came flooding out, steady and sure. He recounted every detail, from the moment he first arrived at school that day to the events that followed. He spoke about how he was accused of something he didn't do, how he had tried to defend himself, but everything had turned against him. He told the truth, and as he spoke, the words seemed to flow with a clarity that surprised him. He didn't need to embellish, he didn't need to prove anything. The truth was all he had, and it was enough. After he finished, Mark nodded and stepped back, allowing Janet's lawyer to have her turn. Janet's lawyer, a woman named Deborah Crane, stood and approached the stand. Her movements were precise and deliberate, and her gaze never wavered from Trey. Trey felt the weight of her presence, like she was already preparing to dismantle him. Mr. Johnson, Deborah began, her voice smooth and measured, you're telling this court that you're an innocent victim in all this. But what if I told you that there's evidence to suggest otherwise? What if I told you that your own actions show a different side of this story? Trey's heart skipped a beat. He had known this was coming, he had known Janet's lawyer would try to discredit him. But hearing those words, seeing the way Deborah was staring him down, made it all feel so much more real. I'm listening, the judge said, her voice cutting through the tension. Deborah turned to the jury and gestured toward a large screen in the front of the courtroom. The lights dimmed as a video began to play. Trey's heart raced as he realized what it was. It was a surveillance video from the school, a grainy, low-quality clip showing him and Janet standing in the hallway, arguing. The footage was shaky, but there was no mistaking it, it appeared as though Trey was physically pushing Janet against the lockers. The courtroom was dead silent as the video played, and Trey felt his chest tighten. His mind spun in panic. This was the last thing he had expected. It looked so real, so damning. His hands trembled as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Deborah stopped the video, turning back to Trey. Care to explain yourself, Mr. Johnson? That video certainly doesn't match up with your story, does it? Trey's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. How had they gotten this footage? What was it supposed to prove? I didn't do that, Trey said, his voice strained. That's not what happened. You're not seeing the whole picture. I was trying to get away from her, to leave. I never pushed her. I was trying to protect myself. But his words fell flat. The video was hard to argue with, and the jury's faces were unreadable. He could see the doubt creeping into their expressions. He could feel the shift in the room, the suspicion in the air. "Is that so?" Deborah asked, her voice low and menacing. "Then why does the video show you lunging at her in what appears to be a fit of anger?" "I didn't," Trey began, but the words stuck in his throat. Mark stood quickly, intervening. "Your Honor, I object. This footage has been presented out of context. There is no audio, no clear understanding of what happened before or after this moment. The video alone doesn't tell the full story." The judge nodded, clearly noticing the objection. "Sustained. The jury will disregard this evidence for now." Deborah, however, wasn't finished. She returned to her seat, but not before giving Trey a smug, satisfied look. Trey's hands were clammy, his heart pounding in his chest. His confidence, which had held strong up until now, had started to waver. Was this it? Was this how it all ended? But before he could spiral too far, Mark leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. Stick to the facts. You've got this." Trey nodded, trying to steady his breathing. He wasn't going to let this one piece of footage ruin everything. He had the truth on his side. And as long as he stuck to that, he could make it through this. The battle was far from over, but Trey was determined to win. The courtroom was silent as the tension in the air was palpable. Trey felt the weight of Deborah Crane's gaze, the smugness of her victory hanging over him like a cloud. The video footage had thrown a wrench into his confidence, but deep down, he knew he wasn't done yet. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let a single piece of distorted evidence unravel everything. The judge gave a short nod, signaling the end of the video footage, but Trey could still feel the ripple it caused. The jury shifted in their seats, their eyes glued to him, uncertain. The words, anger, violence, and push lingered in the air like ghosts. Mark stood up to address the court, his voice steady, yet clearly laced with the seriousness of the situation. "Your Honor, I request that the court allow us to present further evidence that demonstrates the context of this incident," Mark said, standing tall. "What we've just seen is one perspective of a much larger interaction. Without the full context, it's misleading and unfair to my client." The judge turned her eyes to Deborah, who gave a slight nod in agreement. The judge looked back at Mark. "You may proceed, Mr. Davis. But we're working with limited time here," she said, her tone stern yet fair. Mark glanced at Trey before he returned to his argument. "Thank you, Your Honor." He then motioned to the court officer, who retrieved a set of documents. "We've compiled several eyewitness testimonies and video clips from before this event occurred that offer crucial context. And we would like to submit them for review." The court watched in silence as the officer displayed the footage on the screen. This time, the video was different. It showed a clear sequence of events leading up to the altercation between Trey and Janet, and it was more than just a blur of movements, it was a full, detailed record. In the new footage, it was clear that Janet had been the one to instigate the confrontation. The footage from moments before showed Janet shouting at Trey, her finger pointed directly in his face. She seemed to be taunting him, pushing him into a corner. The tension escalated as Trey, unable to get away from her, had instinctively raised his hands, not to strike, but to protect himself. He backed away, but Janet, in her anger, had followed him closely, forcing him against the lockers. At this point, Trey had no choice but to push her away to break free. As the video played, the jury began to shift in their seats, whispering among themselves. Trey could see the disbelief in their eyes, the doubt from the earlier video was slowly beginning to evaporate. This was a game changer. The judge looked over at Janet and her lawyer. "It seems this video presents a different narrative, counselor," she said, her voice cool. Deborah Crane's face tightened, but she remained composed. "Your Honor, the context is clear, but what about the escalation afterward? It's evident that Mr. Johnson's actions led to harm. We have witnesses who can attest to his hostility. Perhaps, Mark interjected, but we have just as many witnesses who will testify that Mr. Johnson was the one being attacked, and that he had no other choice but to defend himself. Deborah shot a glare at Mark before looking back at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the video. We all know that in these situations, actions have consequences. Mr. Johnson is trying to rewrite what happened that day, but the truth is, he put his hands on Ms. Carleton. Mark didn't miss a beat. What Ms. Carleton did, Your Honor, was escalate a situation. She went after my client, cornered him, and only when she pushed him to his limits did he react. There's no proof he ever intended harm, only that he was trying to protect himself. The judge turned to the jury, who appeared to be deeply invested in the back and forth. Trey's heart beat fast, but now there was a glimmer of hope. The full picture was coming together. The truth wasn't just his word against Janet's, it was in the evidence. And with every word Mark spoke, the momentum was shifting. As the trial continued, Janet's lawyer did everything she could to paint Trey as the villain. She summoned witness after witness who claimed that they had seen him act in anger, seen him look hostile before the confrontation. But as each piece of testimony came forward, Mark countered with irrefutable evidence, texts between Trey and his friends, footage showing Janet's escalating behavior, and statements from teachers who had witnessed Janet's previous manipulations. But it wasn't just about the facts. Trey's testimony, delivered with raw honesty and conviction, was slowly winning the jury over. He spoke about how he tried to keep things peaceful, how he never wanted to hurt anyone, but how he had been backed into a corner by Janet's actions. He spoke of the shame of being wrongly accused, of the isolation he'd felt, and how he wished things could have gone differently. Each word seemed to pierce through the armor of doubt that had surrounded him. By the time the closing arguments began, it felt like a shift had taken place. It wasn't just the video footage or the testimonies, it was Trey's unwavering resolve to stand up for himself, no matter the cost. When it was finally time for closing statements, Mark stood before the court, his voice commanding the room. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we've seen today is a tragedy. It's a tragedy that a young man like Trey Johnson, who only wanted to protect himself, has been dragged through this legal nightmare. It's a tragedy that someone like Janet Carleton, who had every opportunity to de-escalate the situation, chose to lie and manipulate. But it's also a tragedy that Trey's life has been torn apart, simply because he tried to do the right thing. The truth is, he wasn't the aggressor. He was the victim of a cruel set of circumstances that he had no control over. And that's why we ask you to find him innocent of all charges. The room was quiet as Mark finished. Trey felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over him. It was in the jury's hands now. The judge called for a recess, and the court emptied as people filed out, their murmurs filling the air. Trey and his mom exchanged a quiet glance, both of them nervous but hopeful. "Do you think it's enough?" Trey asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tasha smiled at him, her eyes full of pride. "I think you did great. You told your truth. Now, we wait." The waiting felt like a lifetime. Hours dragged on as Trey, Mark, and his mom sat in the courthouse hallway, their nerves on edge. The clock ticked loudly in the background, each minute stretching on forever. Trey could feel his stomach twisting in knots. The uncertainty was the hardest part. Finally, the doors to the courtroom opened, and the jury returned. The judge took her seat, and the courtroom fell silent once more. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the jury foreman said, standing up. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Trey Johnson, not guilty of all charges." Trey's heart stopped for a moment. Then, the reality of the verdict hit him like a wave, and a rush of relief flooded through him. He stood up slowly, as if in a daze, his body trembling from the weight of the moment. His mom stood beside him, tears filling her eyes. "You did it, baby. You did it," she whispered, holding him tightly. Trey could hardly believe it. After everything, after all the pain and suffering, the the truth had prevailed. Janet's lies had been exposed, and Trey was finally free. It was over. But as Trey stood there, the relief settling in, he knew one thing for sure: his life had changed forever. And no matter what happened next, he had proven that the truth was worth fighting for. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the verdict echoed in Trey's mind. Not guilty. The words reverberated like a slow, steady drumbeat in his chest. It felt surreal, almost like he was floating above it all, watching himself from a distance. The jury had sided with him, and for the first time in weeks, the weight he had been carrying seemed to lift, even if just for a moment. He turned to look at his mom, who had tears in her eyes. Her face, once full of worry and fear, was now illuminated with a smile of overwhelming relief. It was like she had been holding her breath for weeks, and finally, she could exhale. "You did it, Trey." "We did it," she whispered, squeezing his hand tightly. Trey smiled, though it felt strange on his face. He hadn't expected to feel this much relief. After all, the ordeal wasn't just over for him, but for her too. The courtroom had been a battleground for both of them. They had fought through the anger, the tears, and the doubts together, and now they could finally begin to heal. Mark, who had been standing by their side throughout the trial, gave them both a proud smile. "Congratulations. You stood your ground when most would have crumbled. That takes guts." Trey nodded, though his thoughts were a whirlwind. The fight hadn't been easy, and even now, standing in the aftermath, he wasn't sure what was coming next. He had been vindicated, but that didn't undo the pain of the past few months. The anger and confusion he had felt from the moment Janet had falsely accused him still lingered in his mind like a shadow. As the courtroom began to empty, the cold reality of what had just happened started to sink in. There would be interviews, media coverage, and the inevitable questions from everyone. Everyone wanted to know what it had been like, how it felt to be caught in a scandal like that. And Trey wasn't sure how to answer. He didn't know how to talk about it without the weight of it all crushing him again. But for now, he just wanted to breathe. He wanted to step away from the spotlight, from the judgment, and let the moment of peace sink in. The burden of being accused was gone, but the scars of the experience were still fresh. That evening, after everything had calmed down, Trey and his mom sat in their modest living room, the television flickering quietly in the background. Trey had turned his phone off earlier. He didn't want to deal with any social media noise, the interviews, or any of the public fallout. For the first time in weeks, it felt like they could just exist. "Do you think she'll ever stop trying to tear us apart?" Trey asked, breaking the silence as he leaned back in the couch. His mom sighed deeply. "I don't know, baby. People like Janet don't always give up easily. But you've got something she can never take from you." Trey raised an eyebrow, surprised at his mom's words. "What's that?" "The truth," she said simply, her voice steady. "And no matter how hard she tries, no one can ever take that from you." Trey nodded slowly, appreciating her words. It was something he needed to hear. The last few months had been a blur of lies and accusations. But now, after everything, the truth was on his side. No one could change that. It didn't erase the hurt, but it did give him the strength to move forward. The next few weeks were a blur of interviews, public appearances, and media frenzy. Trey had expected the attention, but nothing could have truly prepared him for how invasive it would feel. Reporters camped outside his house, cameras following his every move, strangers stopping him on the street to ask about the trial. The world wanted answers, wanted to know everything. But Trey was exhausted. He didn't have the energy to relive everything. Instead, he focused on the few things that gave him peace: his family, his friends, and his community. One evening, he met up with his best friend, Jordan, who had been his rock throughout the whole ordeal. Jordan had always been there for him, and Trey was grateful for it. As they sat at a small table in a local cafe, Trey finally felt like he could let his guard down. "I don't know how you did it, man," Jordan said, shaking his head. I would have lost my mind. But you, through everything, you kept it together. I'm proud of you. Trey let out a small laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. I didn't feel like I was keeping it together. I was just doing what I had to do. Jordan took a sip of his drink and leaned back in his chair. Well, whatever it was, it worked. You're free. That's the most important thing. Trey nodded, but there was a lingering question in his mind. What now, though? I mean, the trial's over, but I don't feel like everything's fixed. What happens next? Jordan paused, looking at Trey carefully. You take it one day at a time. It's going to take time for people to trust you again, to forget the rumors. But you've got people who know the truth. You've got your mom, me, Mark. You've got your truth, and no one can take that from you. Trey smiled at his friend, grateful for his support. It was true, his world had been shaken, but there were people who still believed in him, people who would help him rebuild. As the days passed, Trey began to find his footing again. He returned to school, where he was greeted with a mixture of sympathy, curiosity, and respect. Some students still whispered behind his back, but many others had started to stand by him. The teachers who had been silent throughout the trial now offered him words of encouragement. Trey's reputation, while forever marked by the false accusations, was slowly beginning to heal. But it wasn't just school that he had to navigate, it was the world beyond. News articles and social media posts about his case continued to circulate. Trey couldn't escape the past, not entirely. It would always follow him. But he had learned something important: the truth had power. And if he kept fighting for it, no one could take away his future. One evening, as Trey sat with his mom in their living room, watching TV together, a message popped up on his phone. It was from Detective Shaw. We're still watching Janet. The case isn't over. Stay vigilant. Trey stared at the message for a moment, feeling a shiver run down his spine. Just when he thought it was over, it seemed like there were still lingering threats. Janet might have lost in court, but she hadn't disappeared from his life. Not yet. Trey took a deep breath, feeling his resolve harden. He had survived this far. And if she was still out there, he would be ready. For now, though, he would hold on to the victory. He had his truth, his family, and his future. And no matter what came next, he would face it head-on. The fight wasn't over, but neither was he. Trey had always imagined that once the trial ended, life would return to normal. The media frenzy would subside, the whispers would fade, and he could finally go back to just being a regular teenager. But as the days passed, he realized that normal was a thing of the past. The air outside had a crisp bite to it as fall began to take over, but Trey's world still felt like it was stuck in an endless cycle of uncertainty. The whispers in the hallways, the sideways glances, the occasional phone call from reporters, it wasn't as intense as it had been during the trial, but it was enough to remind him that the scars of what had happened weren't going to disappear overnight. It wasn't just the case that had changed his life. The way people saw him, the way he saw himself, had shifted. But even amid all the noise, one thing had become clear: Trey was stronger than he had ever realized. That Saturday, Trey decided to take a walk to clear his mind. His mom had been pushing him to get out more, to not let the weight of everything hold him back. So, after a long week of dodging the press and trying to keep his head down at school, he put on his hoodie and sneakers, leaving his phone behind. It felt strange, but refreshing, to not be constantly checking for messages or notifications. The weather was perfect, a mix of cool and sunny, with just enough breeze to make it feel like the start of something new. He walked through his neighborhood, past the park where he used to play basketball with Jordan, and then down the street toward the local diner. It was a small, no-frills place where the food was good, and the people were friendly. As he entered, the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. The waitress, an older woman named Ruth, smiled at him as he slid into a booth. Well, look who it is, she said, setting down a menu. Haven't seen you in a while. How've you been, Trey? Trey smiled back, feeling a wave of comfort from the simplicity of the moment. Been better, Ruth. But I'm hanging in there. How about you? She raised an eyebrow. Oh, keeping busy. But I hear you're the talk of the town now. They're all still buzzing about the trial. Trey's smile faltered for a moment, but he shook it off. Yeah, I guess I'm kind of hard to ignore now. Ruth studied him for a moment, then gave him a knowing look. Well, I'm glad you're back. Sometimes, it's the small victories that matter most. Trey nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of those words. Small victories, he wasn't sure how he felt about that. It seemed like a polite way of saying that the bigger things were still out of reach. But he pushed that thought aside, focusing instead on the present. I'll take the usual, Ruth. Thanks, he said, trying to shake off the melancholy creeping in. Coming right up. As Ruth disappeared into the kitchen, Trey pulled his phone out of his pocket and checked the time. He had to meet Jordan soon. The two had planned to catch up and talk about their plans for the upcoming school year. Trey didn't know how much longer he could stay in the small town he'd grown up in. The weight of the past was heavy, and even if the case was behind him, it still lingered like an echo. He looked up as a familiar face walked into the diner. It was Marcus, one of Trey's old friends from the basketball team. Marcus had been one of the few people who never doubted him during the trial. He had always known Trey was telling the truth, even when the evidence seemed to suggest otherwise. Hey, man, Marcus greeted, sliding into the booth across from Trey. Heard about the verdict. Glad it worked out for you. Thanks, Marcus, Trey said, his voice quiet but sincere. It feels good to finally have it over with, Marcus nodded, his expression serious. I can only imagine. But I'm glad you're doing okay. We were all worried about you. It wasn't just about the case, it was about you as a person. We all knew it was tearing you up. Trey met his friend's gaze, feeling a surge of gratitude. I appreciate that. It was hard, but I'm stronger now. It's like I learned a lot about myself through all of this. Marcus grinned. Good. That's the way to look at it. And don't forget, we've got your back. Always. Trey smiled. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to hear that until now. Even with the uncertainty still hanging over him, having the support of his friends and family made all the difference. Later that afternoon, Trey and Jordan walked through the park, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. They hadn't talked much during the walk, both were lost in their own thoughts. But there was comfort in the silence. Finally, Jordan spoke. So, you've been quiet lately. How are you really feeling about all this? Trey exhaled slowly, the question hitting him harder than he expected. I'm not sure, man. On the one hand, I'm relieved it's over. But on the other hand, I feel like I'm still waiting for the other shoe to drop, Jordan nodded, his eyes understanding. I get it. The media's still out there. People still have their opinions. But you know what? You're not defined by what happened. You're defined by what you do now. Trey stopped walking, turning to face Jordan. What do you mean? Jordan smiled. What I mean is, the past is done. It can't hurt you anymore. Yeah, people are gonna talk, and yeah, things might not be the same. But you get to decide how you move forward from here. You can let it define you, or you can choose to be the person you want to be. A lot of people won't forget, but that doesn't mean you have to carry it with you forever. Trey stared at his friend, the weight of his words sinking in. It was easy to forget that he had a choice. For so long, he had been consumed by the trial and the aftermath, but now, finally, he had the chance to redefine himself. You're right, Trey said quietly, a smile forming on his face. It's time to stop looking back. I've got a future to focus on. Jordan grinned. Exactly. And you've got a whole bunch of people cheering for you. The next few days passed in a blur. Trey and his mom went over plans for the future. Trey had applied to a few colleges before the trial began, and now that the case was behind him, he felt ready to look ahead. He wasn't sure what his future would look like, but he knew he wanted to make a difference. He wanted to help others who had been through what he had experienced, those who had been falsely accused and trapped in the system. It was then that Trey realized something profound: his fight had never just been about clearing his name. It had been about finding his purpose. As he sat at his desk that night, working on a college application essay, Trey began to write about everything he had been through, how the trial had shaped him, how he had learned to trust in the truth and never back down from doing what was right. This was his new beginning. The trial had been a chapter in his life, but now it was time to write the next one. With his future stretched out before him, Trey felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known before. The fight wasn't over. But it had transformed him into someone who was ready to face whatever came next with strength, grace, and the unwavering belief that truth and justice would always prevail. And no matter what, he would never stop moving forward. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?